Full History of Reliance Group, Part 3, 2005 to 2026. Two Brothers, Two Fates, 2005 to 2013. When the Reliance Empire was formally demerged at the end of 2005, India did not experience it as a sterile exercise in portfolio design. It felt like family drama with national economic consequences. Dhirubhai Ambani had built Reliance into one of the defining business houses of modern India, and after his death in 2002, the unresolved question of succession did not remain private for long. It became a public struggle over capital, legitimacy, scale, and the future shape of Indian capitalism. Mukesh and Anil Ambani inherited not just assets, but a mythology. Their conflict mattered because Reliance mattered. It touched shareholders, lenders, regulators, politicians, and millions of Indians who had come to see the group as a symbol of ambition itself. The mechanics of the split looked neat. Under the demerger scheme, shareholders of Reliance Industries received proportional stakes in 4 resulting companies spanning coal-based energy, gas-based energy, financial services, and telecommunications. The scheme became effective on December 21, 2005, and January 25, 2006 was fixed as the record date for share allotments. On paper, this gave the breakup legal symmetry. In reality, it marked the end of a unified command structure and the beginning of 2 very different experiments. Mukesh retained Reliance Industries and with it the industrial core of the old house, refining, petrochemicals, oil and gas, and the integrated logic Dhirubhai had spent decades building. Anil walked away with what many at the time considered the more glamorous set of assets: telecommunications, power generation, financial services, and later entertainment. One brother seemed to own the molecules and smokestacks of the past, the other appeared to inherit the sectors most closely associated with India's future. That interpretation was seductive, but incomplete. The businesses Mukesh kept were not old in the sense of being spent. They were old in the sense of already institutionalized. They generated cash. They possessed engineering muscle. They had project execution capabilities. They were embedded in an operating system that had been trained over decades to build at absurd scale. The businesses Anil inherited were not future-proof. They were future-dependent. They required capital before they produced it. They depended on regulation, credit markets, commodity assumptions, and investor patience. They were sectors where narrative could outrun operating reality. That is why the split, which seemed at first like an injury, became a discipline for Mukesh. It ended the need to co-manage a political truce inside a giant family federation and made him the undisputed allocator of capital inside a narrower but more coherent machine. That machine was hardly modest. It included the Jamnagar refining complex, a petrochemical chain that already embodied the company's appetite for backward integration, and upstream ambitions in the Krishna-Godavari basin that promised to alter India's energy balance. What it no longer included were many of the distractions of governing everything at once. The non-compete arrangement accompanying the split mattered almost as much as the asset division. It was designed to prevent the brothers from colliding immediately in each other's sectors. In practice, it froze the family dispute into the operating system of corporate India. Each brother could claim not only assets, but territory. That helped calm markets in the short term, but it ensured that future expansion would be read through the logic of family boundaries. In the first years after separation, public intuition leaned toward Anil. He was more visible, easier for markets to narrate, and more closely associated with fast-growing sectors. Telecom looked like India's great consumer story. Power looked like the obvious bottleneck business in a rising economy. Financial services sounded modern and scalable compared with pipelines, crackers, and refineries. There was a glamour premium in Anil's portfolio and a solidity discount in Mukesh's. But that solidity discount was exactly where Mukesh's advantage lived. Once the family federation ended, Reliance Industries could become what it had long wanted to be, an execution state. Management attention could concentrate on a smaller number of giant bets rather than dissipate across a domestic Cold War. By the end of the decade, that would matter far more than which brother had looked more fashionable in 2006. Mukesh's first post-demerger years were not a simple victory lap. They were years of concentration. He had to prove that the company under his control was not merely the half that kept the legacy assets. He had to show it could still produce the future. His answer ran on two tracks. One was hydrocarbons in the broadest sense, refining, petrochemicals, upstream oil and gas. The other was a consumer-facing wager that at first looked oddly disconnected from the rest of the empire: organized retail. These two tracks operated on very different timelines and carried very different public temperatures. Hydrocarbons were visible, legible, and already grand. Retail was messy, experimental, and initially underwhelming to critics. Hydrocarbons funded the present. Retail rehearsed a different future. This was the hidden gift of the demerger. Mukesh no longer had to chase applause in multiple unrelated directions at once. He could let refining and oil and gas remain the cash-generating spine while building a new consumer platform at the edge of the empire. Reliance Retail entered organized retail in 2006, beginning with the launch of Reliance Fresh in Hyderabad in November of that year. By the end of fiscal 2006 to 2007, the network had grown to 96 stores. Relative to what Reliance would later become, this was small. Symbolically, however, it mattered a great deal. The company that had mastered fibers, polymers, and fuels was stepping into vegetables, groceries, apparel, electronics, and the habits of Indian households. Many conglomerates treat retail as if it were simply real estate plus procurement plus signage. Reliance approached it as a systems problem: supply chain, cold chain, logistics, sourcing, store formats, inventory turns, information systems, farmer linkages, and the harder question of what an Indian mass-market retailer should actually feel like. That last piece, the emotional grammar of the store itself, took years to develop, but Reliance could afford years. Its industrial cash machine bought it patience. At the same time, the hydrocarbon platform was moving toward a much louder phase. The second Jamnagar refinery and the development of the KG-D6 gas field were undertakings of national scale. They were the kind of projects that made an annual report read like state planning literature. In Reliance's 2008 to 2009 commentary, Mukesh described the year as transformational because the company had commissioned its large refinery and substantially completed its gas development projects. Reliance Petroleum's refinery at Jamnagar began crude processing on December 25, 2008, and shipped its first parcel of products in January 2009. Oil production from KG-D6 had begun in September 2008, and gas production followed on April 2, 2009. Reliance emphasized that the gas development had been brought into production in roughly 6.5 years, faster than the global norm for comparable deepwater projects, and described KG-D6 as one of the world's 5 largest deepwater gas projects. The company argued that its output would transform India's energy balance by doubling indigenous gas production. That mattered in several ways. Economically, it suggested that Reliance could become not just India's dominant private refiner and petrochemical producer, but also the operator of a gas field central to the country's energy story. Symbolically, it allowed Mukesh to recast himself after the split as the brother who could still build at national scale. Politically, it made Reliance's operating success inseparable from questions of supply, pricing, and regulation. That entanglement would prove both powerful and costly. The retail story deserves more attention than it usually gets in shorthand accounts of this era. Because Reliance Retail later became so large, it is easy to imagine that its promise was obvious from the beginning. It was not. For years, it looked more like a workshop than a triumph. Formats proliferated, stores opened and were reworked, and critics wondered whether Mukesh had wandered into a thin-margin business that did not fit the company's industrial temperament. That skepticism was not foolish. Organized retail in India was fragmented, operationally difficult, and politically sensitive. Consumer tastes were local, supply chains leaked. Fresh produce required daily discipline that capital alone could not solve. Retail also attracted cultural resistance in a way petrochemicals did not. The idea of Reliance entering neighborhood commerce triggered anxieties about concentration, displacement, and the future of traditional shopkeepers. And yet, those very features made retail fit Mukesh's post-split worldview. It was long duration, it rewarded logistics, it demanded systems. It could be built format by format and city by city by a company that did not need the business to justify itself immediately. It also offered something the hydrocarbon complex never could: daily intimacy with the Indian consumer. Refining was the industrial face of scale. Retail could become the household face of scale. By 2009, Reliance Retail had more than 900 stores in over 80 cities. The climb was not linear, but it showed something crucial. Mukesh was willing to absorb the awkwardness and expense of an unfinished idea. Many industrialists prefer businesses where competence is quickly legible. Retail made Reliance look clumsy before it looked powerful. Persisting required confidence that the company could learn. By 2011-12, that confidence was beginning to show in the numbers. Reuters, citing the company's annual report, said Reliance Retail's fiscal 2012 revenue reached 75.99 billion rupees, up 25%, with same-store sales growth above 20% in most formats and a network of around 1,300 stores. Mukesh told shareholders in 2012 that he wanted retail sales to reach 400 to 500 billion rupees in 3 to 4 years. Ambitious, but no longer purely theoretical. In fiscal 2013, the business crossed 10,000 crore rupees in revenue, reaching 10,800 crore, up 42% from the previous year. More importantly, it achieved cash break-even at the EBITDA level, reporting 78 crore. That milestone sounds technical, but it mattered strategically. Retail ceased to look like a side project subsidized by petrochemicals and began to look like a real second engine. From the vantage point of 2013, the elegance of Mukesh's post-split structure becomes visible. Hydrocarbons provided strength. Retail absorbed learning and built optionality. One side of the empire produced cash in the present, the other rehearsed the future. Anil's post-demerger path is often reduced to a morality tale about leverage. That is too thin. In the first phase after the split, his businesses did not look irrational. They looked like concentrated exposure to India's most compelling growth themes. Telecommunications still promised scale in a country with rising demand for connectivity. Power addressed one of India's most obvious structural shortages. Financial services offered brand leverage and theoretical scalability. These were not silly sectors. In theory, a well-capitalized promoter with the Ambani name could have created enormous value in each. And for a while, the market rewarded that vision. Reliance Communications was one of India's largest mobile players. In later annual report language, it would still be able to cite 123 million wireless subscribers as of March 31, 2013. The problem was never that customers did not exist. The problem was the relationship between customers, pricing power, capital intensity, and debt. Reliance Power provides the cleanest snapshot of the era's optimism. Its 2008 IPO became a sensation. Reuters reported that the issue, then India's largest IPO, was fully subscribed almost immediately, with most bids coming in at the top end of the range. Investors were buying not an operating cash machine, but a vision of future capacity. In that euphoric moment, Anil's side of the family seemed to embody exactly what post-liberalization India wanted to believe in: big infrastructure, large ambition, and rapid capital formation. But the euphoria cracked quickly. After listing, the stock fell sharply below the IPO price, forcing the company into an embarrassing attempt to protect small investors with a bonus share proposal. Reuters noted the anger of retail holders who felt they had been sold a promise by a company with no operating power plants and little chance of near-term profits. The incident exposed the fragility of Anil's structure. He could attract future-oriented capital very quickly. Converting that capital into durable, cash-generating assets would take far longer. Telecom displayed the same pattern in a different key. Reliance Communications had scale, but Indian telecom was becoming brutally competitive. Tariffs fell, spectrum costs rose, capex remained heavy. Deals that might have relieved pressure were uncertain or politically complicated. The 2008 attempt to combine with South Africa's MTN became entangled in family conflict because Mukesh claimed a right of first refusal under the demerger arrangement. A corporate transaction became another battlefield in the feud. Here, the core problem in Anil's portfolio began to reveal itself. Every major business required favorable external conditions at the same time: financing availability, regulatory clarity, stable input assumptions, and enough market discipline to preserve returns. Telecom needed a less destructive competitive environment or a stronger balance sheet. Power needed fuel certainty, land, clearances, long construction timelines, and patience. Financial services depended on confidence. None of these businesses was forgiving of high leverage plus execution delay. The contrast with Mukesh becomes sharp here. Mukesh's retained businesses also faced political and commodity risk. Oil and gas always do. But the underlying platform was already real. It already possessed industrial habits, cash generation, and execution capability. Anil's businesses were real as well, but more of their value depended on projects not yet completed. Time, therefore, behaved differently for the two brothers. For Mukesh, time could be an ally. It could be used to integrate, scale, and learn. For Anil, time increasingly resembled interest expense. This is why the years between 2005 and 2013 cannot be understood by sector labels alone. One brother owned so-called old economy assets that still produced cash and scale. The other owned so-called future sectors that often consumed capital before producing it. The labels hid the balance sheet physics underneath. If the demerger froze family conflict into corporate boundaries, the gas dispute turned those boundaries into a national legal drama. The conflict centered on natural gas from the Krishna-Godavari basin, especially pricing and supply arrangements involving Anil Ambani's Reliance Natural Resources and Mukesh Ambani's Reliance Industries. What might have stayed a contractual family quarrel became a public test of whether agreements between brothers could override state control over a strategic resource. The stakes were enormous. For Anil's side, cheaper gas would improve the economics of gas-based power and validate key assumptions built into the demerger settlement. For Mukesh's side, and eventually for the government, gas pricing could not be reduced to a family memorandum because the resource existed within a sovereign regulatory framework. Energy refused to remain private. The feud bruised both brothers reputationally, but it did not harm them equally. It made Indian capitalism look almost feudal, as though one of the country's most important business houses had dragged public policy into a family chamber. Strategically, however, Mukesh's position was stronger than the optics. Reliance Industries controlled the asset. It was the operator. It could argue that government-set pricing and sovereign authority were binding. Anil's case depended much more heavily on the moral authority of a family settlement. In May 2010, India's Supreme Court ruled in favor of Mukesh's position in the essential sense that government pricing authority prevailed and the companies would have to renegotiate. Reuters described it plainly. Mukesh had won, state pricing power was binding, and the rival firms would have to return to the table. For Anil, this was more than a legal defeat. It was a strategic wound. Some of the downstream logic of his power ambitions had depended on cheaper gas. Once state authority was affirmed, that logic weakened sharply. The ruling also clarified something larger for the market. Control of the molecule mattered more than fraternal expectation about access to it. In Indian business, Ownership of the resource, command over the operating platform, and alignment with regulatory power often mattered more than moral claims rooted in family settlement. Yet the story did not end with one brother defeating the other in court. Only weeks later, the brothers scrapped most of their non-compete arrangements. In May 2010, the relevant Reliance entities approved an agreement canceling the old restrictions and replacing them with a much narrower understanding focused only on gas-based power generation, with Reliance Industries agreeing not to enter that business until March 31, 2022. Officially, the move was presented as a way to increase operational and financial flexibility and reduce future disputes. On the surface, this looked conciliatory. Strategically, it benefited Mukesh more. By 2010, the asymmetry between the brothers was already emerging. Mukesh regained freedom of motion from a position of growing strength. Anil regained freedom from a position of growing necessity. That distinction mattered immediately. Once the non-compete walls fell, Mukesh could re-enter sectors previously fenced off. In June 2010, Reliance Industries announced its acquisition of a substantial stake in Infotel Broadband Wireless, the only company to win broadband wireless access spectrum in all 22 circles. By fiscal 2011, Reliance reported it owned 95% of Infotel and had invested 4,201.64 crore rupees. Reuters said Reliance planned to invest about $5 billion in the venture over 2 years. This was a bet on broadband and data, better aligned with the next phase of digital infrastructure than with old voice telecom. The sequence matters. Mukesh won the gas battle, helped dismantle the old non-compete walls, and then used that freedom to place a large bet on broadband. He was no longer just defending an industrial inheritance, he was reopening his strategic frontier. The greatest misunderstanding of Mukesh's 2005 to 2013 chapter was that it was only about hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons came first because they supplied strength. The larger achievement was that hydrocarbons financed freedom. Reliance's 2008-2009 year showed the scale of that strength. The commissioning of the new Jamnagar refinery and the bringing on stream of KG-D6 transformed the company. Turnover for the year exceeded 150,000 crore rupees. Exports grew, refining capacity expanded, upstream energy entered a new phase. Reliance was not merely riding prices, it was building giant platforms. Even when the KG-D6 story later became more complicated, its early importance was unquestionable. In its 2010-11 reporting, Reliance said KG-D6 had become the single largest source of domestic gas in India, accounting for almost 35% of national gas consumption and about 44% of domestic gas production. Average daily gas production for the year was 55.9 million standard cubic meters per day, with cumulative production of 1,257 billion cubic feet since inception. That relevance helped make Reliance a natural partner for global majors. In 2011, BP agreed to pay $7.2 billion, plus potential performance payments of up to $1.8 billion for stakes in 23 oil and gas blocks and to form a gas sourcing and marketing joint venture. Reuters described it as one of India's largest foreign direct investments at the time. The deal monetized part of Reliance's upstream portfolio, validated the significance of the assets, brought in deep water expertise, and strengthened Mukesh's balance sheet and strategic flexibility. That last point is critical. Reuters' Breaking Views in 2012 highlighted the contrast between the brothers in unusually blunt terms. Mukesh's Reliance was cash-rich and growing richer with the BP transaction, while Anil's Reliance Communications was struggling to raise funds. That was the essence of the divergence by the early 2010s. Mukesh could use cash generation and monetization to buy future options. Anil increasingly needed financing simply to survive the present. The hydrocarbon story was not entirely triumphant. By 2011 and 2012, criticism over KG-D6's lower-than-expected output and questions over costs and development strategy had intensified. India's federal auditor criticized both the government and Reliance over the field. Reuters later noted that output, which had reached around 60 million standard cubic meters per day in 2010, was expected to decline sharply, leaving India more dependent on imported LNG than many had once hoped. Mukesh's strategy was not invulnerable. The field that had been presented as transformative did not sustain its early promise at expected peak levels. Yet, the structure Mukesh retained gave him resilience. Reliance Industries was anchored by interlinked industrial capabilities. If KG-D6 disappointed relative to early hopes, the group still had refining, petrochemicals, export strength, scale advantages, and a steadily growing retail business. One problem could not define the whole. Anil's structure was less forgiving. When one thesis weakened, it often damaged financing capacity for the rest. There are many ways to explain Anil's decline during these years: regulatory friction, excessive ambition, infrastructure bottlenecks, pricing wars in telecom, the post-crisis funding environment, or over-leverage. Each contains some truth, but the cleanest frame is that debt stopped being a tool of expansion and became the central fact around which the group's choices had to revolve. Telecom makes this vivid. By 2010, Reliance Communications was already seeking relief through asset monetization, including a planned tower deal with GTL Infrastructure. Reuters reported that the transaction would materially reduce debt and that Arcom's debt before the transaction stood at roughly 330 billion rupees, including financing for recently acquired 3G spectrum. Analysts welcomed the move because deleveraging had become essential, not optional. The deeper problem was that each relief measure exposed the need for another. Asset sales dragged, fundraising plans shifted. By January 2012, Reuters reported that Chinese state banks had agreed to lend $1.18 billion to Reliance Communications so it could repay foreign currency convertible bonds. The same report describes the company as debt-laden, noted that it had posted 9 straight quarters of declining profits amid ferocious competition, and observed that it had struggled to sell its tower business. This was no longer the language of temporary strain inside a growth franchise. It was the language of narrowing strategic room. The company's own reporting reinforces the picture. In its 2012-13 annual report, Reliance Communications stated that stakeholder equity stood at 33,850 crore rupees, while net debt was 38,858 crore rupees, yielding a net debt-to-equity ratio of 1.15 times. It also reported 123 million wireless subscribers. The juxtaposition captures the tragedy: real customer scale but weak monetization under brutal conditions, compounded by the financing burden accumulated during expansion. Reuters' coverage in 2012 and 2013 kept returning to the same point. In August 2012, the company was described as carrying around $7 billion in net debt. In January 2013, it reported a 44% fall in quarterly profit, with finance costs rising after refinancing foreign currency convertible bonds. Revenue could still grow modestly, but interest costs were consuming the story from within. By May 2013, Reuters was still describing Arcom as burdened by $7.2 billion in debt. This changed the company's strategic posture. Mukesh could think in terms of adjacency and new platforms. Anil increasingly had to think in terms of refinancing, monetization, and defense. One brother was using the balance sheet as a weapon. The other was fighting his own. Power offered no clean rescue. Reliance Power was not fictional. It did execute important pieces of its pipeline. In its 2012-13 annual report, the company rightly highlighted the commissioning of the first 660-megawatt unit of the 3,960-megawatt Sasin Ultra Mega Power Project, describing it as the largest integrated power plant and coal mining project in the world, and noting that it had been commissioned ahead of schedule. Coal production from the associated Moher mines had begun in September 2012. These were real accomplishments. ROSA, another project, delivered substantial generation in its first full year, but the wider portfolio still suffered from the curse of long distance between promise and cash flow. The same annual report acknowledged serious issues at Krishnapatnam following regulatory changes in Indonesia, the intended coal source. That brief admission opens onto a broader truth. The economics of a power project could be destabilized by fuel assumptions far beyond the promoter's control. Reliance Power also illustrates the danger of capital markets loving the story before the operating system is ready. The enormous IPO had loaded the company with expectation. Years later, large pieces of the portfolio remained exposed to delay, regulation, and shifting fuel economics. The market that had once applauded abstract scale eventually wanted evidence in steel, coal, transmission, and cash. This does not mean Anil accomplished nothing. Projects were built, funding was raised, strategic options were explored. But the architecture of the group made compounding difficult because every major business depended heavily on external cooperation. Telecom needed a rational market. Power needed stable fuel economics and execution runway. Finance needed confidence. When India's policy environment became more jagged and global funding more demanding after the financial crisis, that architecture became harsher to sustain. The 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath did not affect the brothers symmetrically. Both operated in capital-intensive sectors, but their business structures translated macro shock differently. For Mukesh, the crisis created volatility, not existential fragility. Oil prices swung, global demand softened, uncertainty rose, yet Reliance still had export capacity, giant operating assets, and projects either being completed or entering production. Its 2008-2009 year could still be credibly called transformational. The crisis hurt, but the company had sufficient industrial depth to absorb the blows and keep building. For Anil, the post-crisis world was less tolerant of distant promise and more skeptical of leverage-heavy models. Equity enthusiasm cooled, debt became more expensive and more central. Infrastructure bottlenecks in India, already severe, became more punishing in a tighter funding environment. What had looked like growth capital increasingly resembled an obligation chain. This is the difference between strain and fracture. Mukesh's system experienced strain, Anil's began to show fractures. If one had to choose a single year in which the brothers' paths became unmistakably different, 2010 is the strongest candidate. The Supreme Court ruling on gas weakened Anil's hand and affirmed Mukesh's. The non-compete arrangement was largely dismantled, restoring freedom to both sides but favoring the stronger one in practice. And Mukesh re-entered communications-adjacent business through Infotel Broadband. From one angle, these were separate events, legal, familial, strategic. From another, they were a reordering of the post-demerger map. The original split had attempted to compartmentalize the future. By 2010, those compartments were collapsing, and Mukesh was better positioned to exploit the collapse. That is why the demerger became a gift for him, not because it handed him perfect assets on day one, but because it simplified command long enough for him to strengthen what he kept, survive the family war, and re-enter strategic expansion from a position of strength. The narrower empire became the stronger launchpad. Anil, by contrast, experienced 2010 less as liberation than compression. Ending non-competes did not repair debt, reverse the implications of the gas ruling, or change the economics of telecom. Flexibility without balance sheet power often just means a wider field in which to feel vulnerable. By the early 2010s, the divergence no longer required interpretation. Markets could see it in cash, debt, execution, and tone. Mukesh's Reliance had completed one of the largest energy investment cycles in Indian corporate history, monetized upstream assets through BP, retained control of a vast refining and petrochemical base, pushed retail toward meaningful scale, and reopened its horizon with broadband. Even the weaknesses in the story, especially KGD6's underperformance relative to early hopes, did not erase the larger picture. There were too many engines and too much financial strength for one problem to define the group. Anil's businesses increasingly looked like a collection of partially achieved futures. Telecom still had subscribers but weak profitability and heavy debt. Power had meaningful milestones but too little timely cash relative to its ambitions. Financing transactions themselves started to define the public identity of the group. The empire had not vanished, but it had become defensive. Observers captured this mood with unusual bluntness. Reuters and others contrasted Mukesh's cash-rich position with Anil's need to raise funds. Rich lists recorded the widening gap in their fortunes. Market capitalization evaporated from Anil Group companies on bad days because investors had stopped granting patience to leverage heavy narratives. These were not mere mood swings, they were judgments about durability. What makes this chapter so instructive is that the difference was not simply one of talent in the abstract, it was structural. Mukesh's side generated cash from giant operating assets while building new platforms. Anil's side often needed future success in order to justify past financing. One architecture compounds, the other repeatedly asks to be rescued by the next favorable turn. The contrast is especially sharp in how the two brothers related to time. Mukesh could invest patiently in retail, tolerate learning curves, and wait for adjacency to ripen because the industrial base kept generating strength. Anil's businesses had far less patience available because debt clocks were always running. One brother could afford experiments, the other increasingly could not. By 2013, the asymmetry was fully visible. Reliance Retail had crossed 10,000 crore rupees in revenue and reached cash break-even. Reliance Industries as a whole reported record turnover above 371,000 crore rupees and net profit above 21,000 for fiscal 2013. Reliance Communications, by contrast, still carried net debt greater than stakeholder equity, while Reliance Power was commissioning milestones inside a portfolio exposed to long-dated risk and fuel uncertainty. The brothers were no longer running rival versions of one inheritance, they were living in different economic weather systems. There is a temptation to read Mukesh's success here as proof that supposedly conservative industries beat glamorous ones. That would be too simple. Refining and upstream gas were not easy, passive, or conservative in any comforting sense. They were enormous bets exposed to political scrutiny, commodity swings, and engineering risk. Retail, meanwhile, was anything but conservative for an Indian conglomerate in 2006. The better lesson is coherence. Mukesh's retained empire after 2005 was coherent enough to absorb giant projects, disappointments, and experimentation without losing strategic direction. It possessed a central logic rooted in integration, cash generation, execution capability, and patient scale. Even retail, which appeared unrelated to refining, fit that logic when viewed through systems rather than sector labels. Anil's empire was coherent in brand, but less coherent in economics. Telecom, power, and financial services could coexist inside a holding structure, but they did not reinforce one another with the same structural force. Telecom did not naturally make power easier. Power did not naturally stabilize finance. Financial services could help at the edges of capital access, but they could not solve the operating realities of regulated utilities or hyper-competitive mobile markets. In periods of stress, the businesses did not rescue one another, they asked for capital simultaneously. This is where the demerger's hidden asymmetry becomes decisive. Mukesh did not merely receive older assets, he received the assets whose operating logic was deepest. Anil did not merely receive younger assets, he received those whose success depended most heavily on the surrounding world remaining generous. The demerger, in hindsight, looks less like an equal division than a divergence mechanism. It separated a compounding machine from a capital-hungry aspiration stack. Not instantly, not perfectly, and not without reversals, but decisively enough that by 2013, the result was unmistakable. Looking back from that point, it is clear that the 2005 demerger did not simply divide an inheritance, it changed the conditions under which each brother would have to prove himself. Mukesh's victory in this chapter was not that he avoided risk, he took immense risk. He poured capital into refining, deepwater gas, and retail on a scale few Indian companies could match. He accepted criticism when KGD6 failed to live up to its early promise. He stayed with retail when it still looked awkward. He re-entered communications through broadband before the payoff was visible. But those risks were contained within a coherent industrial system capable of bearing them. The demerger narrowed his field just enough to make concentration possible. The split was a gift because it forced focus. Anil's tragedy was not that he chose frivolous sectors. He did not. Telecom, power, and finance were exactly the sectors a rising India seemed to need. The tragedy was that he inherited the most capital-hungry and externally contingent parts of the empire at a time when both the global and domestic environments were becoming less forgiving. He required favorable regulation, financing, fuel assumptions, and execution at once. When even one of those conditions failed, debt amplified the damage. When several failed together, the model lost grace. Two Brothers, Two Fates is not melodrama, it is a concise analytic truth. They began with the same name, the same house, and the same national mythology, but the structures they governed were built to live in time differently. By 2013, Mukesh had already revealed the pattern that would define the next era: use giant cash-generating platforms to finance adjacency, reinvention, and scale. By 2013, Anil had already revealed the pattern that would haunt his group: large ambition constrained by debt, delays, and shrinking strategic room. The demerger did not merely settle a family quarrel, it exposed the deeper truth of each half. Mukesh's side was a machine that could simplify, execute, and expand again. Anil's side was an array of promises that required the world to stay generous. India, in the end, rewarded the machine. Geo, the Trojan Horse, 2013 to 2016. A note on names. During the years covered here, the operating company at the center of Reliance's return to telecom was Reliance Jio Infocom Limited, usually shortened to Jio. The name Jio Platforms belongs to a later holding company structure created in 2019. Because that later name became more famous, histories sometimes slided backward in time. Between 2013 and 2016, this was not yet the story of a mature digital holding company. It was the story of an immense, risky, unfinished telecom machine being assembled in public, and of Mukesh Ambani's belief that control of India's digital pipes would someday matter as much as control of its refineries. When Reliance Industries returned to telecommunications, it did not come back through the front gate wearing a conqueror's crown. It came back dressed as a broadband operator. That disguise mattered. After the Ambani brothers divided the Reliance empire, telecommunications had fallen to Anil Ambani's side of the family settlement. The 2005 arrangement, brokered by their mother Kokilaben Ambani after the succession crisis following the Rubai Ambani's death, did more than split assets. It attempted to freeze the future. Through a non-compete arrangement, it tried to keep the two camps out of each other's domains. For a few years, the arrangement looked tidy on paper and uneasy in practice. It was never obvious that a sprawling business family could permanently agree not to pursue entire sectors of the economy. India was changing too quickly, and telecommunications in particular was becoming too central to everything else. In an earlier era, telecom could be treated as its own industry, a market for minutes, towers, spectrum, and subscriber counts. But as smartphones gathered force, telecom began to bleed into media, commerce, payments, entertainment, cloud infrastructure, and even state capacity. Control over connectivity was slowly becoming control of economic oxygen. The formal break with the old family settlement came in May 2010 when Reliance Industries and the Reliance ADA Group announced that they had canceled all existing non-compete arrangements created in January 2006, leaving only a narrower restriction around gas-based power generation. This reopened the map. Telecommunications was once again fair game for Mukesh Ambani's Reliance. The timing was surgical. Barely had the old barriers been removed when Reliance Industries moved to acquire a 95% stake in Infotel Broadband Services, the company that had unexpectedly emerged as the only successful bidder for broadband wireless access spectrum in all 22 telecom circles in India's 2010 auction. At first glance, Infotel looked like a clever but limited entry vehicle. Broadband wireless access was not the same as building a conventional mobile voice operator. It suggested data, not the full national assault associated with older telecom empires. Yet that was precisely why the move had wedge-like quality. Reliance was not buying a dying voice network or trying to rebuild itself in the image of incumbents. It was buying a nationwide position in a future-facing layer of the market and betting that regulation, technology, and consumer behavior would converge in a way that would let a data-first entrant become something much larger. The years from 2013 to 2016 were the period in which that latent ambition became fully visible. They were the years in which a spectrum holding was turned into an all-India telecom license, that license was turned into a greenfield fourth-generation network, and that network was wrapped in devices, apps, content, distribution, and narrative until it no longer looked like a phone company launch. By the time Jio formally debuted to the public in September 2016, it was not offering a slightly better tariff plan. It was announcing a different economic grammar for Indian telecom. To understand why Jio's arrival felt so destabilizing in 2016, it helps to remember how limited the original Infotel acquisition could have appeared. India in 2010 was not yet organized around the assumption that data would swallow voice. The large incumbents were built on a patchwork of second-generation and third-generation economics. Voice minutes, roaming charges, SMS revenues, top-up behavior, distributor incentives, and spectrum scarcity shaped the habits of the industry. Tariffs were intricate because the business model itself was intricate. Operators had grown up in a world where services were distinct and monetized separately. A minute was one thing, a text message was another. Data was a third, still expensive, uneven, and psychologically unfamiliar for much of the market. Broadband wireless access spectrum did not obviously solve that. It was associated with data services and did not instantly grant the full voice rights that came with a unified telecom model. Reliance was buying optionality. The asset looked narrow enough not to provoke universal disbelief, but broad enough to support an enormous future if adjacent conditions shifted. Those conditions did shift. In February 2013, the government moved to allow holders of broadband wireless spectrum to offer voice services after paying an additional fee and migrating to a unified licensing framework. That was one of the hinge points of the entire Jio story. It transformed what might have remained a bounded data business into the seed of a full telecom re-entry. By October 2013, Reliance Jio Infocom had received a unified license in all 22 service areas, becoming the first operator in India with a pan-India unified license granted in that form. This was the moment when the disguise began to fall away. A great deal of business history is the history of labels turning out to be temporary. A textile trader becomes an industrial empire. A bookstore becomes a cloud computing backbone. A search engine becomes an advertising machine, then an operating system, then an artificial intelligence company. The label broadband operator became too small for what Reliance was building the moment it could legally turn data capacity into a full service stack. Because Reliance had entered through a newer technological doorway rather than through inherited legacy infrastructure, it could design from first principles. That mattered. Incumbents were carrying technological sediment. They had enormous operations, but also large installed bases tied to older architectures, older revenue habits, older distribution assumptions, and older capital allocation logic. Jio could imagine an all-IP network from the outset. In plain terms, that meant voice itself could be treated not as a separately metered relic, but as an application running over data. Voice over LTE, or VoLTE, was the hinge that allowed Jio to attack the industry's pricing philosophy. If voice became one more packet-based service on an advanced network, then charging for it the old way stopped looking like nature and started looking like habit. Reliance's filings in 2013 and 2014 show how deliberately it was arranging the pieces. Jio was not only the only private player with broadband wireless spectrum in all 22 circles, it also moved to acquire 1800 MHz spectrum in 14 key circles. The company presented the resulting configuration as an integrated FDD LTE and TDD LTE ecosystem. Strategically, Jio was layering complementary spectral assets to improve coverage, capacity, and service quality. It was building a spectrum mosaic rather than gambling on a single band. Mukesh Ambani's industrial temperament becomes visible here. He did not treat telecom like a light consumer venture. He treated it as a capital-intensive systems problem that rewarded those willing to build for scale before demand fully materialized. The market could debate launch delays, mock the cost, or question the timing. But once Reliance decided telecom was core infrastructure, it moved with the reflexes of a company accustomed to projects that required billions before cash flow arrived. By early 2014, the outline was clear. Jio was no longer a speculative broadband play. It was a nascent national operator with legal permission to offer voice, a growing stock of complementary spectrum, and a parent willing to spend with a horizon longer than most rivals or analysts found comfortable. The question was no longer whether Reliance had re-entered telecom. The question was what kind of telecom company it intended to become. The best strategic assaults do not merely identify an industry, they identify its concealed weakness. Jio's launch is often remembered only as a price war, a blast of free voice and cheap data that bulldozed weaker players and frightened stronger ones. But price was an instrument, not the whole score. What made it so destructive was that it was aimed at a market whose structure had grown brittle. India had hundreds of millions of mobile users long before Jio's public debut, yet the broadband story remained underdeveloped relative to the country's scale. Reliance's 2013-14 annual report, citing regulator data, pointed out the contrast starkly. By January 2014, India had more than 893 million mobile users, but only about 14.5 million broadband connections. The old telecom order had succeeded at connectivity in one sense, while under-delivering in another. India was mobile-rich and broadband-poor. That mismatch created two opportunities. The first was obvious. There was vast unmet appetite for usable, affordable mobile data. The second was subtler. Because the broadband experience was still thin for so many users, the company that dramatically improved it would not merely steal customers from rivals, it could change behavior itself. It could increase usage, raise expectations, and redefine what a mobile connection meant in daily life. In such markets, demand is not a fixed pie waiting to be redistributed. Demand can be induced, accelerated, and culturally normalized. Reliance understood this. Jio's ambition was framed not simply as telecom, but as digital life. In annual reports and public speeches, the company described end-to-end digital services spanning communication, education, healthcare, security, financial services, entertainment, and government-citizen interfaces. Reliance was refusing to think of the network as a standalone commodity. It was thinking in layers. Connectivity would bring people in, devices would make usage possible, apps and content would deepen engagement, distribution and identity systems would reduce onboarding friction. Once users lived inside the system, telecom economics would be only one part of a larger story. That worldview was dangerous for incumbents because many were still playing a narrower game. They were telecom companies in the classical sense, optimizing revenue from subscriber bases shaped by a prior technological generation. Jio was willing to monetize differently because it was building toward a different kind of empire. Reliance did not need the venture to behave like a cautious standalone operator at birth. It could absorb pain, subsidize adoption, and pursue share with a patience that came from the balance sheet of a conglomerate. It also understood the emotional weakness of the market. Indian consumers were used to complexity, tariffs were numerous, fine print mattered, data allowances could feel punitive, voice remained an object of billing logic rather than an invisible feature of participation in digital life. An industry trained to charge for everything had created room for a rival to look almost moral simply by simplifying the offer. Mukesh Ambani leaned into that tone when Jio launched. He spoke not just as a businessman introducing plans, but almost as if he were correcting a public wrong. Data, he argued, had been priced far too high. Voice should simply be free on an all-IP network. A country aspiring to digital modernity should not be held back by legacy telecom economics. These claims were self-interested, of course, but they were effective because they contained a truth users could feel. This was the real terrain of battle between 2013 and 2016. Jio was not merely building cell sites and buying spectrum, it was building a story about what Indian telecom had failed to become, then preparing to embody the alternative. Jio did not spring into existence at launch. It spent years as an immense construction project that had to be assembled at national scale before it could credibly make its promise. Later, when subscriber numbers exploded and competitors staggered, it became tempting to treat the years before September 2016 as mere prelude. In fact, they were the substance. The company spent heavily and broadly. It accumulated spectrum in multiple bands, laid or secured access to fiber, struck infrastructure sharing arrangements, worked on submarine cable capacity, towers, city fiber, intercity fiber, enterprise systems, distribution processes, app ecosystems, and device strategy. The annual reports from 2013-14 through 2015-16 read not like the notes of a firm waiting for a marketing event, but like the progress diary of a complex industrial mobilization. Telecom histories often privilege visible assets. Towers are visible, spectrum auctions are visible, launch events are visible. But the hidden carpentry of telecom is what determines whether a grand promise survives first contact with real usage. Capacity planning, backbone strength, interconnection, software stability, onboarding workflows, billing systems, customer support logic, device compatibility, and content integration all determine whether scale becomes triumph or embarrassment. Reliance's management understood this well enough to delay, test, and expand rather than rush prematurely into mass commercialization. By 2013-14, the company was already describing a greenfield initiative that went beyond connectivity alone. It aimed to create a digital services platform across broadband, applications, and content. That reporting also shows the breadth of the infrastructure sharing arrangements Jio stitched together. It secured access to Bharti's submarine cable network and joined the Bay of Bengal Gateway Consortium. It arranged city and intercity fiber sharing and tower access with Reliance Communications, an irony rich enough to deserve pause. Mukesh Ambani's telecom re-entry was, in part, using infrastructure tied to the camp of his brother, Anil, the very branch of the family with which telecom had once been ring-fenced. Jio also entered tower-sharing agreements with Bharti Infratel and Viome Networks. Those partnerships mattered because they accelerated rollout. Reliance was happy to rent where renting sped scale, provided the strategic system remained under its control. At the same time, the company rolled out fiber-to-the-home infrastructure in more than 900 cities and towns even before mass launch. This was not a firm thinking only about mobile handsets and prepaid SIMs. It was laying the groundwork for a broader digital architecture. The mobile network was the spear tip, but the ambition ran behind it into fixed broadband, home connectivity, enterprise possibilities, and urban digital consumption. In annual disclosures, Jio repeatedly described itself as building a state-of-the-art all-IP network capable of superior voice and data. That signaled a refusal to patch old architectures indefinitely. Greenfield networks are expensive, but they can be optimized for the traffic patterns and services of the era ahead instead of the revenue patterns of the era behind. This philosophy shaped the cadence of testing as well. By 2013-14, the company reported field tests in places including Navi Mumbai and Jamnagar, using beta experiences to refine the service. It launched trial Wi-Fi hotspots in cities such as Ahmedabad, Baroda, and Surat, recording tens of thousands of unique device interactions. By 2014-15, it was conducting wider field tests, experimenting at tech festivals and college events, and implementing Aadhaar-based eKYC to support paperless activation. In January 2016, services were already being tested among more than 100,000 group employees and their families. By the 2015-16 annual report, the trial base had grown past 1.5 million users, including employees, channel partners, and vendors, with average monthly consumption above 26 gigabytes of data and 355 minutes of voice. Those trial figures were extraordinary because they showed the world Jio was trying to summon into existence. If users on the beta network were consuming data on that scale, then the question was no longer whether Indians wanted mobile broadband. The question was what would happen when price and friction collapsed. Any history of Jio that reduces spectrum to auction trivia misses the strategic heart of the matter. Spectrum was the grammar in which Jio wrote its business model. The 2,300 MHz broadband wireless access spectrum acquired through Infotel gave Jio a nationwide position, but it also came with propagation characteristics that made it less than ideal as a lone foundation for universal mobile service. Higher frequency spectrum can deliver substantial capacity, but coverage quality and indoor penetration are not solved by capacity alone. This is why Jio's later purchases in 1800 MHz and 800 MHz mattered so much. They were structural complements, not opportunistic trophies. In February 2014, Jio acquired spectrum in the 1800 MHz band in 14 key circles. In March 2015, it acquired additional spectrum rights in the 800 MHz and 1800 MHz bands across 13 circles.
By May 2015, Reliance reported that Jio held spectrum in either 800 MHz or 1800 MHz, or both, in 20 of 22 circles, in addition to its pan-India 2300 MHz holding. This shows Jio evolving from a clever entrant into a complete one. The 2300 MHz layer provided enormous data capacity. The 1800 MHz and 800 MHz acquisitions improved the network's ability to cover territory more effectively and support a more robust mobile experience. The company was building a national 4G machine that would not have to apologize for being born in a data niche. This multi-band strategy reflected a deeper commercial insight. If Jio was going to break the market by pushing customers toward mass data use and making voice effectively free, then it could not behave like a discount carrier with patchy service. The promise of abundance required actual abundance. You cannot teach consumers to watch more video, use more apps, make more IP-based calls, and move more of daily life onto the network unless the network is engineered to hold that behavioral migration. A telecom launch can still fail with strong network assets if users cannot enter the system easily, affordably, and habitually. Jio therefore evolved not as a bare network, but as a stack. The first important layer was device access. Advanced fourth-generation networks are transformative only if a large population has compatible hardware. India in the mid-2010s was clearly moving towards smartphones, but affordability still constrained usage. Through Reliance Retail, Jio introduced Life smartphones, which by the 2015-16 annual report had become the fifth largest smartphone brand in India by shipments, with a 7.1% market share. Life was an accelerant, a way to put compatible devices into users' hands and widen the base for Jio preview offers before full launch. The second layer was apps and content. From the outset, Jio described itself as providing an entire digital services ecosystem, not merely network access. Its messaging emphasized communication, entertainment, video, messaging, and related applications. This made the service feel richer to consumers, and it increased the likelihood that users would experience Jio as a daily environment rather than a commodity SIM. If an operator can become the container for multiple forms of digital life, churn becomes more psychologically difficult and monetization pathways multiply over time. The third layer was identity and onboarding. Aadhaar-based eKYC was one of the quiet weapons of the Jio machine. In 2014-15, Reliance highlighted the demonstration of paperless activation through Aadhaar. In mass market telecom, administration can be destiny. Every form, every identity document, every delay in activation is friction. If Jio could remove paperwork and shorten the path from desire to active service, it could convert curiosity into scale faster than rivals accustomed to slower processes. The fourth layer was distribution and testing culture. Jio's public story is often compressed into the grand launch event at Reliance Industries' annual general meeting in September 2016. But by then, the company had already been building sales and distribution systems and testing them through employees, partners, and device users. The preview offer tied to Life smartphones widened the pre-launch user base, letting Jio rehearse mass acquisition in a semi-controlled environment. Seen together, these layers reveal why the Trojan Horse metaphor is apt. Jio carried a whole commercial ecosystem inside its shell. A consumer might first notice a cheap device, or free voice, or a generous data allowance, or easy activation, or a bundle of apps. But behind each entry point sat a carefully integrated system. Reliance was not trying to win a tariff comparison. It was trying to establish a new default habitat for digital consumption. Jio's launch delays became a recurring subject of analyst chatter before 2016. Mukesh Ambani indicated in mid-2015 that commercial 4G operations would begin by December of that year. They did not. In markets trained to equate speed with competence, delays are often read as weakness. Yet, in Jio's case, delay may have been one of the clearest signs that Reliance was determined not to squander the scale of its bet through premature exposure. The reason was simple. Jio was promising a qualitatively better network experience, lower data prices, simpler plans, and effectively free voice on an all-IP architecture. A service entering with such claims does not get the indulgence given to a modest regional operator. It becomes a national stress test from day one. Reliance's annual report suggests management knew this. In 2015-16, the company described Jio as being in an extensive beta launch and stabilization phase, with over 1.5 million trial users, helping to refine the customer proposition. The longer Jio waited, within reason, the more time it had to expand its surrounding ecosystem. More spectrum could be added.
More fiber could be secured. More devices and applications could be integrated. More trial data could be gathered. More users could be conditioned through preview programs. Every month of delay carried cost, but it also thickened the eventual assault. The formal public debut came at Reliance Industries' annual general meeting on September 1, 2016. Mukesh Ambani did not present Jio as a new telecom plan. He presented it as the infrastructure of India's digital future. The speech was carefully built. It framed data not as a luxury, but as a necessity for modern citizenship and economic participation. It presented India as a country whose digital aspirations had been hampered by poor affordability and inadequate quality. It cast Jio as the instrument that would remove those bottlenecks. Most memorably, it attacked voice pricing at the root. On Jio, Ambani said, all domestic voice calls would be free with no national roaming charges. Customers, in effect, should pay for one service, not multiple layers of archaic telecom billing.
Free voice was not just a consumer gift, it was a theory of the network stated in public. If voice lived on LTE as an application, then metering it separately in the old style began to look not only unattractive, but conceptually backward. The speech paired this with a direct attack on data pricing. Ambani argued that Indian consumers had been paying outrageously high effective rates for mobile data. Jio's own effective rate would be dramatically lower, with base rates presented as more than 90% below comparable market levels. At the same time, the company promised simplification. Where the market had produced a forest of tariff plans, Jio would offer a much smaller, cleaner set. Then came the most explosive part, the Jio welcome offer. Starting September 5, 2016, Jio would provide free access to its digital services with unlimited LTE data, national voice, video, messaging, and its suite of applications at no charge through the end of the year. The public was not being asked to sample cautiously, it was being invited to flood in. The welcome offer worked on several levels. It removed price as a barrier to trial. It generated immediate attention and word of mouth. It accelerated the collection of user data and usage patterns that could help optimize the network. And it applied severe psychological pressure to rivals, who now faced the optics of defending the old order against a newcomer speaking in the language of abundance. Most price wars are really disputes inside an existing market structure. Jio's 2016 offer was more radical because it aimed at the structure itself. If a new entrant merely offers cheaper calls, incumbents can match or nearly match the move. If a new entrant says voice should effectively be free because the network is all IP and voice is just another data application, incumbents face a philosophical as well as financial challenge. They can lower prices, but in doing so, they validate the idea that the old pricing regime was indefensible. They can resist, but then they risk looking like defenders of an outdated model. Jio chose a point of attack that made defense intellectually awkward. Lowering the effective price of data sharply did not merely attract bargain hunters, it expanded the imaginable uses of the phone itself. Streaming, richer messaging, broader app use, and longer session times become more natural when consumers are not constantly budgeting for scarcity. Jio was subsidizing a behavioral migration that would favor the network designed for high-volume usage. The arithmetic was especially cruel because Jio did not need to think like a mature incumbent from day one. A legacy operator already serving a huge base has to worry about protecting revenue streams tied to older voice and data structures. Every tariff cut risks cannibalization. Jio had no such legacy base to defend. It could launch into the future without apologizing to the past. This is where the larger Reliance balance sheet re-enters the story. The company could afford to view telecom customer acquisition as strategic infrastructure spending rather than near-term income dilution. It treated adoption as an asset under construction. Free service, lower pricing, device seeding, and bundled applications were the cost of rewriting the market's behavioral baseline. The initial consumer response confirmed Reliance had judged the appetite correctly. Jio reported that it had crossed 16 million subscribers in the first month after launch, a rate of customer acquisition it described as the fastest achieved by any telecom operator or technology startup globally. By the end of December 2016, Reliance said the subscriber base had reached 72.4 million, with average additions of roughly 600,000 users per day. It is worth pausing here on what could have gone wrong. The welcome offer model carried real risks that a less well-capitalized parent might not have survived.
Free service for an extended period meant the cash burn was enormous, and the eventual transition to paid plans was not assured. Many observers in late 2016 and into 2017 questioned whether users hooked on free service would tolerate any meaningful pricing. Jio also faced sustained public criticism that its strategy depended on a parent company willing to subsidize losses indefinitely, a kind of advantage incumbents could reasonably call unfair.
These criticisms were not silly. They turned out to be wrong in the specific Indian case, but the model would not have been replicable in a market with weaker latent demand or a parent with less appetite for sustained loss. Of course, rapid adoption also revealed the system's stress points. One immediate flashpoint was interconnection with incumbent operators. Reliance complained that customers faced severe call failure problems because rivals were not releasing enough points of interconnection, the technical handshakes needed for calls to pass smoothly between networks. Jio later claimed that tens of millions of calls were failing daily. This dispute was political economy under pressure. Incumbents had little incentive to ease the path of a rival whose launch model threatened to erode their economics. Jio, meanwhile, could cast the interconnection battle as proof that the old order was trying to deny consumers the benefits of genuine competition. Regulators were drawn into the conflict. What is striking in hindsight is how quickly the first shockwave moved beyond telecom metrics. Jio became a public conversation about access itself. Cheap data changed how people talked about video, messaging, entertainment, and the everyday internet. The network's consumer meaning expanded beyond calls and browsing into a broader sense that a different digital standard had arrived. It is easy, looking back from Jio's triumph, to caricature incumbents as complacent fools. That would be unfair. Companies like Bharti Airtel, Vodafone India, and Idea Cellular were not sleepy provincial actors. They had built enormous businesses in one of the world's most competitive telecom markets. Yet they were vulnerable, and the reason was structural. First, they were burdened by legacy revenue logic. Voice and traditional pricing complexity were central to how the business had matured. Even when executives recognized that data would dominate the future, they still had to manage the revenue consequences of shifting too abruptly away from established patterns. Second, many incumbents were balancing multiple technological generations at once. Networks built over time carry technical debt. Spectrum positions reflect historical auctions and strategies. Migration is possible, but rarely as clean as building greenfield. Third, incumbents did not have the same balance sheet patience combined with cross-business strategic motivation. They were telecom firms defending telecom economics. Reliance was a conglomerate, pursuing control over digital infrastructure for reasons that went beyond quarterly telecom returns. Fourth, incumbents faced a narrative trap. If they argued that Jio's prices were unrealistic, customers heard that they could not or would not offer similar value. If they slashed prices in response, they accelerated pressure on their own balance sheets. If they emphasized network quality, Jio could point to its greenfield, all-IP design and enormous capex commitments. Jio did not merely undercut them, it narrowed their respectable options. Normal competition creates pressure. Jio created redesign. It pressed incumbents financially while also changing the customer meaning of telecom service. Most of the visible consolidation deals unfolded after 2016, but the logic of consolidation was already embedded in the launch itself, the way a crack is embedded in glass before it visibly runs. Telecom is a brutal industry even in calm periods. It combines large fixed costs, constant capital expenditure, regulatory dependence, pricing pressure, and consumer expectations shaped by relentless comparison. A shock of the kind Jio delivered could not remain a mere promotional episode. Operators with weaker balance sheets, poorer spectrum positions, heavier leverage, weaker brand power, or less adaptable networks were always likely to become casualties or merger candidates. That is exactly what began to happen soon afterward. In early 2017, Vodafone confirmed talks to merge its India business with Idea Cellular, a combination widely understood as a response to the harsher economics unleashed by Jio. Bharti Airtel moved to acquire Telenor India. Smaller or weaker players found survival increasingly difficult. Over the next few years, the number of serious private operators in India shrank sharply, and the industry structure became much more concentrated than it had been in the pre-Jio era. This was not an accidental side effect.
A company that makes voice free, slashes data pricing, and normalizes heavy usage in a capital-intensive market is forcing a new minimum efficient scale. Once the required scale and capital intensity rise, marginal players suffer first. The field narrows. For Reliance, this was not necessarily a bug. A more consolidated market could eventually support healthier economics for the survivors, especially if those survivors had already absorbed the pain of transition and built large user bases under the new behavioral regime. There is an irony here. Geo arrived speaking the language of democratization, data for everyone, voice as a free service, lower prices, digital inclusion. All of that was real in immediate consumer terms. But democratization at the level of access can coexist with concentration at the level of industrial structure. Consumers get more and pay less, while the number of firms capable of serving them shrinks. Modern digital infrastructure often works that way. To treat Geo only as a telecom story is to stop one layer too early. The larger significance of the 2013-2016 period lies in what it says about Reliance Industries itself. For decades, Reliance had excelled by mastering foundational industrial layers. Textiles led to polyester, polyester to petrochemicals, petrochemicals to refining. Geo represented a parallel move into the foundational layers of the digital economy. If refineries and polymers were essential to the physical age, then fiber, spectrum, data, and digital distribution would be essential to the next one. Mukesh Ambani's insight in this period was that telecom could serve as the entry point for a wider digital system. This is why Geo was wrapped in apps, devices, home broadband ambitions, enterprise possibilities, and startup rhetoric. The goal was not to become a better version of a traditional carrier. The goal was to become the infrastructure layer beneath a sprawling Indian digital ecosystem. That ambition helps explain why Reliance was comfortable with strategies that looked aggressive or extravagant within conventional telecom logic. From the vantage of a narrow telecom investor, free voice and huge launch subsidies may look alarming. From the vantage of a conglomerate trying to seize a foundational position in a digitizing economy, they look more intelligible. Customer acquisition was colonization of the interface through which future services might flow. The later creation of Geo platforms in 2019 would make this logic more explicit by housing telecom, digital applications, and technology assets under a broader umbrella. But the intellectual blueprint existed well before the holding company name. Between 2013 and 2016, the blueprint was being built in concrete, fiber, code, licenses, devices, applications, onboarding systems, and massive beta testing. By the time Mukesh Ambani stood up in September 2016 to declare voice free and data affordable, the announcement was the public release of a long-prepared industrial offensive. Geo's importance rests on four transformations. It transformed telecom economics by treating voice as an application and data as the core utility. It transformed consumer expectations by normalizing the idea that mobile broadband could be abundant, central, and woven into everyday life. It transformed market structure by raising the minimum scale and capital intensity needed to compete, thereby setting consolidation in motion. And it transformed Reliance itself by giving the conglomerate a commanding position in the modern digital infrastructure of India. That is why Trojan Horse is more than a catchy chapter title. India thought it was watching the launch of another telecom operator. What had actually arrived was a broader redesign of connectivity itself, backed by one of the country's most formidable industrial groups. By the end of 2016, the consequences were already visible. Customers had rushed in, competitors were on the defensive, consolidation loomed, and Reliance, having once ruled the grammar of physical infrastructure, had found its way into the grammar of digital life. Empires rarely announce their full intentions at the gate. They arrive in forms the old order thinks it already understands. The Digital Empire, 2017 to 2020. By the time the year 2020 was over, it had become too small to describe Geo as a telecom business. That description was still technically true, just as it would be technically true to describe a port as a stretch of water with cranes. It missed the point. A port matters because it organizes movement. It becomes valuable because everyone who wants to move goods, money, and ambition must pass through it.
Between 2017 and 2020, Reliance did something similar in the digital economy. It took what had begun as a brutal telecom disruption and steadily refashioned it into a system that could carry content, commerce, software, cloud services, payments, small business digitization, devices, and eventually capital itself. This period was not merely the story of subscriber growth, although the growth was astonishing. It was also not merely the story of investor enthusiasm, although the money that arrived in 2020 was without precedent in Indian corporate history. It was the story of architecture. Mukesh Ambani and his lieutenants were building a structure in which the network, the apps, the handset strategy, the home broadband line, the media assets, the commerce rails, and the cloud layer all reinforced one another. Jio was being taught to behave not like a single product, but like a national digital operating system. Telecom by itself is a hard business. It requires huge capital expenditure, ruthless price competition, and patience in the face of regulation, spectrum costs, and consumer expectations that rise faster than average revenue per user. Digital infrastructure is the layer on which many businesses can be built. It can make money directly, but it can also create leverage for adjacent businesses. It can shape consumer habit. It can lower acquisition costs across an empire. It can turn distribution into destiny. This was the insight that global investors eventually recognized. Facebook did not write a multi-billion-dollar check into Jio platforms because it wanted exposure to Indian mobile tariffs. Google did not commit $4.5 billion because it wanted to own a slice of another carrier. KKR, Silver Lake, Vista, General Atlantic, Mubadala, ADIA, TPG, LC Catterton, PIF, Intel Capital, and Qualcomm Ventures were not all crowding into the same deal because they had independently discovered a passion for selling SIM cards. They were buying into the proposition that Reliance had built, or was close to building, a foundational digital layer for India. One chronology point worth fixing. Some summaries of this era loosely imply that Reliance acquired Network 18 in 2017. That is not correct. Reliance, through the independent media trusts that it funded, moved to acquire control of Network 18 in 2014. The real significance of the 2017 to 2020 period is not that Network 18 suddenly entered Reliance's orbit, but that its strategic role became clearer. Media, news, entertainment, finance content, streaming video, and eventually digital subscriptions all became more valuable when married to Jio's distribution and data infrastructure. The years from 2017 to 2020 should be read as one continuous campaign. In 2017, Reliance set out to finish the first phase of the telecom land grab by bringing the excluded masses of feature phone India into its ecosystem. In 2018 and 2019, it thickened the network into a platform, stretching from mobile broadband to home broadband, enterprise cloud, IoT, and digital services. In 2020, during a pandemic that shattered balance sheets and froze capital markets, Reliance performed a feat that was half capital raise and half declaration of sovereignty. It restructured its digital assets into Jio platforms, sold minority stakes to a parade of world-class investors, became net debt-free ahead of schedule, and announced to the world that Jio was no longer merely a telecom insurgent. If the later investor frenzy made Jio look inevitable, 2017 was the year when Reliance still had to prove that its revolution could extend beyond early adopters and urban smartphone users. Jio had already detonated the Indian telecom market with free voice, ultra-cheap data, and promotional offers aggressive enough to redraw industry economics. But disruption at that scale can stall if it remained trapped among people who already have access to smartphones, apps, and data-rich habits. India was also a market still full of feature phones and 2G consumers, people who were technically connected but practically excluded from the modern internet.
Mukesh Ambani addressed that problem with a characteristic mix of rhetoric and engineering. At the 2017 annual general meeting, he presented Jio not only as a communications company, but as an instrument of digital inclusion. He emphasized that India had overtaken the United States and China in mobile data usage, that over 100 million customers had signed up in less than 170 days, and that Jio had already crossed 125 million users. He also underlined something even more strategic. There were still more than 50 crore feature phone users in India who were paying dearly for inferior service and remained outside the full digital economy. That was the logic of the Jio phone, announced in July 2017. On the surface, the device looked almost quaint, a reinvention of the feature phone for the 4G era. In strategic terms, it was a bridge. For hundreds of millions of Indians, the barrier to internet adoption was not merely monthly tariff cost, it was the upfront price of a smartphone. Entry-level devices in the range of roughly 3,000 to 4,500 rupees remained out of reach for many users. Jio's answer attacked both the device problem and the service problem simultaneously. The company promised voice that would always be free on the Jio phone, an all-unlimited plan at 153 rupees per month, and an effective handset price of zero, backed by a refundable security deposit of rupees 1,500 after 36 months. Rather than wait for incomes to rise enough for everyone to afford smartphones, Reliance would collapse the barrier itself. The Jio phone was a customer acquisition machine, a behavioral migration tool, and a declaration that Jio intended to own the transition from old India to new India. The brilliance of the move was that it made inclusion economically strategic rather than philanthropic. Every feature phone customer who migrated to Jio's 4G ecosystem became more than a telecom user. That person became reachable by apps, content, payments, video, education, commerce, and whatever else Reliance decided to pipe through the network. The device itself supported television viewing through an accessory cable, making the phone not just a communications tool, but a media endpoint for households that might not yet own smart televisions. Reliance did not want a billing relationship alone, it wanted habitual digital presence inside the home. By the close of the 2017-18 financial year, Jio's subscriber base had reached 186.6 million. The annual report boasted that the business had turned profitable in its very first full year of operations. Across that subscriber base, data consumption ran to 506 crore gigabytes, while voice traffic crossed 414 crore minutes per day. India was no longer sampling mobile data, it was inhaling it. That change had strategic consequences far beyond telecom. Cheap, abundant data creates a different kind of consumer. Video becomes normal. App discovery accelerates. Regional language content explodes. Small merchants become reachable through messaging and digital storefronts. Advertising moves. Commerce follows attention. Once Jio had demonstrated that it could attract mobile users at historic speed, the next challenge was obvious. A large subscriber base is powerful, but a subscriber base by itself does not make an empire. The years 2018 and 2019 were therefore about thickening the network into a platform. The financial and operating data shows the scale of the march. By March 2019, Jio's subscriber base had risen to 306.7 million. Reliance described it as the fastest telecom operator globally to cross the 300 million subscriber mark. Importantly, Jio was no longer simply a growth story purchased with free offers. It had become the #1 telecom operator in India by adjusted gross revenue, which meant its market position was translating into economic power. But the more important story sat underneath the subscriber figures. Reliance's reports and public presentations began to describe Jio in increasingly systemic terms. Jio was being framed as a digital ecosystem with applications across commerce, education, healthcare, media, entertainment, and financial services. At the 2019 annual general meeting, Mukesh Ambani offered the clearest public blueprint yet. Jio had crossed 340 million users, he said, and was still signing up more than 10 million new customers each month. The core and aggregation layers of its converged network had been 5G ready since day one and could be upgraded to 5G at minimal incremental cost. If true, it meant that Jio's earlier capital expenditure had been designed with future protocol shifts in mind.
Ambani began naming the new engines of growth around the mobile business. There was the Internet of Things, including a narrowband IoT platform aimed at connecting vast numbers of sensors and devices. There was fixed broadband for homes and businesses through GeoFiber. There was enterprise and small business broadband. There was cloud. There was a startup ecosystem.
The GeoFiber announcement was especially revealing. Reliance said it had received more than 15 million registrations from nearly 1,600 towns, based on which it planned to reach 20 million residences and 15 million business establishments. Commercial launch was scheduled for September 5, 2019, with tariffs ranging from 700 rupees to 10,000 rupees per month. Home broadband created a second channel into the household, one suited not merely to data transport, but to television, OTT aggregation, gaming, video conferencing, smart home services, and commerce. Reliance strengthened that distribution architecture further through cable and local network relationships. Earlier in 2019, it had acquired controlling stakes in Hathway, DEN, and GTPL, giving it working relationships with more than 30,000 local cable operators. Rather than imagine broadband as a pure over-the-top future detached from existing last-mile realities, the company absorbed and aligned the legacy distribution layer. The same logic extended into enterprise cloud. In August 2019, Jio and Microsoft announced a broad strategic alliance. Microsoft would bring its Azure cloud platform into Jio's planned data centers in India, while Jio would offer connectivity, computing, storage, and business solutions to enterprises, especially small and medium businesses. The deeper logic was that Reliance intended to own the infrastructural stack, from consumer access to enterprise workloads. It wanted the household on GeoFiber, the shopkeeper on GeoMart and WhatsApp, the small company on Geo Connectivity and Azure-backed cloud services, and the government or large enterprise on Geo-supported infrastructure. Even the startup angle fit the same pattern. Ambani told startups that much of their cost base went toward cloud and connectivity, and he offered support through Geo. A platform business wants complementers, builders who make the ecosystem more useful. By helping startups with infrastructure, Jio could position itself as the default substrate for new digital services in India. This phase of thickening the network is also where one begins to see why later investors would classify Jio as digital infrastructure rather than telecom. Jio was building wireless broadband, home broadband, enterprise connectivity, cloud-adjacent services, IoT, software applications, and potentially commerce integrations, all bound to a customer base growing at warp speed. Once that structure exists, each additional service lowers customer acquisition costs for the next. Telecom incumbents usually hope for cross-sell. Reliance was building for compound advantage. If the network was the skeleton of the emerging digital empire, media was becoming its voice. That is where the Network 18 story enters this chapter, not as a surprise acquisition in 2017, but as a strategic asset whose value ripened as Jio matured. When Reliance funded the acquisition of control over Network 18 in 2014 through the Independent Media Trust, it justified the move by arguing that the assets would differentiate its 4G business at the intersection of telecom, web, and digital commerce. The portfolio included digital properties such as Money Control, First Post, IBN Live, and Book My Show, alongside television assets like CNBC TV 18, CNN IBN, Colors, and others through related structures. Reliance wanted more than pipes. It wanted the experiences that travel through the pipes. By 2017 to 2020, that logic began to look less theoretical. Jio had created the distribution layer. Network 18 and associated media properties could now become content engines, attention engines, and trust engines for that distribution layer. In a world where data had become cheap and abundant, content was no longer a decorative appendage. It was one of the main reasons users stayed inside an ecosystem.
The 2019-20 reports give a strong picture of how substantial Network 18's digital footprint had become by the onset of the pandemic. The company described itself as one of the top 10 digital news and information players globally and the number 2 player in India in digital content. Across digital news and information, it claimed roughly 172 million unique visitors across devices, with 39% growth in unique visitors during the fiscal year. Money Control remained a formidable financial digital destination, with its mobile app drawing more than 3.7 million unique users, and its new subscription product, Money Control Pro, gathering over 1.5 lakh paying customers in less than a year. News18.com, operating across 13 languages, expanded to around 106 million unique visitors, up 48% over March 2019. Voot Select, the subscription version of Voot, launched in March 2020, adding another paid digital layer to the entertainment portfolio. Each of these properties mattered in a different way. Money Control was a high-intent audience of investors, savers, and professionals, the very sort of consumer segment with value far above the average data user.
News 18's language footprint was strategically potent because Reliance's mass-market ambitions depended on regional India, not merely on English-speaking metro elites. Voot and Voot Select mattered because video consumption was one of the strongest use cases for cheap data and home broadband. Book My Show, though hit by the pandemic, represented another consumer habit platform adjacent to payments, entertainment, and event-led commerce. The network can move packets, but media shapes what people do with those packets. Once Reliance could influence both layers, it could begin to create reinforcing loops. Jio lowered the cost of consumption. Network 18 and Viacom 18 properties increased the reasons to consume. Jio set-top boxes and Jio TV Plus could aggregate and simplify access to multiple OTT platforms. Jio Fiber could make streaming easier inside the home. Content partnerships and in-house production through Jio Studios could turn distribution power into negotiating leverage. Because these experiences sat within a broader Reliance universe that included retail, the path from watching to browsing to buying could be steadily shortened. By late 2019, the pieces existed, but the structure still needed a name and a legal body. That body became Jio Platforms Limited. According to Reliance's 2019-20 annual report, Jio had invested more than $50 billion since inception to create the largest and most advanced digital and connectivity ecosystem in India. New growth areas identified by the company included narrowband IoT, infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service, mixed reality, gaming, education, healthcare, agriculture, and manufacturing. On its own, such a list could be dismissed as a corporate wish catalog. What made it serious was the restructuring that accompanied it. Reliance brought together the digital assets, spanning connectivity and technology investments, under a single wholly owned subsidiary, Jio Platforms Limited. This mattered for several reasons. First, it clarified the story. Investors, partners, regulators, and even internal managers could now see the digital empire as a coherent unit rather than as a scattering of initiatives across multiple entities. Second, it ring-fenced the platform logic. Jio Platforms was not only the mobile network, it housed the applications, the digital services, and the investments or acquisitions associated with the ecosystem. Third, it created a cleaner vehicle for partnerships and capital raising. Reliance said explicitly that the restructuring created a debt-free and financially strong holding company that could pursue growth opportunities and attract strategic investments and partnerships. Jio Platforms was effectively a translation device between Ambani's industrial imagination and global capital's valuation frameworks. Infrastructure investors, private equity firms, sovereign wealth funds, and technology companies all needed something they could buy into. A telecom subsidiary alone would have told only part of the story. A holding company containing both the connectivity layer and the platform layer could be pitched as something larger and more future-facing. Once this logic is appreciated, many of Reliance's moves from 2017 onward snap into focus. GeoPhone was user acquisition for the platform. GeoFiber was a route for larger bundles and richer services. Network 18's digital assets were content and attention nodes. The Microsoft Alliance was a cloud bridge under the platform. The future GeoMart WhatsApp partnership would be commerce riding on top of communications infrastructure. There was another, subtle, but crucial effect of this restructuring. It changed the narrative around debt and investment. For years, critics of Reliance had worried about the immense capital deployed into Geo and the stress that such investments could place on the balance sheet. Once Geo Platforms could be presented as a consolidated platform company with its own strategic logic, those sunk costs ceased to look only like telecom capex. They could be reinterpreted as the foundational investments required to build a national digital stack. And then the pandemic arrived. Much of the global economy was locking down, supply chains were convulsing, retail traffic collapsed, offices emptied, balance sheets across sectors went defensive, companies hoarded cash. Yet in the middle of this black swan event, Reliance moved forward as if history had decided to prove its thesis for it. COVID-19 did not create India's digital transition, but it accelerated and exposed it. Every category that Geo had been preparing to serve suddenly mattered more. Video conferencing became essential, home broadband demand increased, digital education surged, messaging tools became quasi-public utilities, small merchants and grocery delivery channels became critical, enterprise cloud and remote work infrastructure became harder to postpone. Reliance's own annual reporting from this period makes the alignment vivid. Geo launched GeoMeet, its video conferencing service, and within days it had been downloaded more than 5 million times. The platform was then used to host Reliance's own annual general meeting virtually, supporting roughly 3.2 lakh concurrent users across 42 countries and 468 cities, making it one of the largest shareholder meetings in the world. The Government of India's Corona Help Desk on WhatsApp, powered by Geo Haptic, served more than 30 million citizens in just 3 months. Geo TV Plus was positioned as a single sign-in aggregator for content across multiple OTT platforms. GeoMart expanded its services across more than 200 cities, while grocery order flow reportedly ran at 4 times the pre-lockdown level. This is what infrastructure looks like during stress. Its value becomes more visible, not less. A fashionable app can lose relevance in a downturn. An infrastructure layer often gains it because other activities collapse into dependence on it. The pandemic also sharpened the logic of integrating commerce with communications. Reliance Retail and WhatsApp would later enter into a commercial partnership to accelerate GeoMart and support businesses on WhatsApp. This was the moment when the telecom narrative fully gave way to the platform narrative. The Facebook deal also functioned as a clearing event for other investors. Once a global strategic technology player moved first, financial investors could arrive not nearly as contrarians, but as participants in a newly certified story. And arrive they did, in rapid succession. On May 4th, Silver Lake announced an investment of $5,655.75 for a 1.15% stake. The Reliance noted that the valuation represented a premium to the Facebook deal, a detail that suggested demand for the asset was strengthening even in sequence. On May 8th, Vista Equity Partners committed 11,367 crore for 2.32%. On May 17th, General Atlantic agreed to invest 6,598.38 crore for 1.34%. On May 22nd, KKR committed another 11,367 crore for 2.32%. Then in early June came Mubadala with 9,093.6 crore for 1.85%, Silver Lake and co-investors with an additional 4,546.8 crore for 0.93%, ADIA with 5,683.5 crore for 1.16%, TPG with 4,546.8 crore for 0.93%, LC Catterton with 1,894.5 crore for 0.39%, and Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund with 11,367 crore for 2.32%. By June 19th, Reliance announced that Jio Platforms had raised 115,693.95 crore from these investors, while Reliance's rights issue had raised 53,124.20 crore. Combined, the company had raised over 168,818 crore in just 58 days.
Including the previously announced transaction with BP and Fuel Retail, Mukesh Ambani declared that Reliance had become net debt-free, well ahead of his earlier target date of March 31, 2021. The platform fundraise was also a balance sheet transformation and a reputational coup. Then the campaign widened further. On July 3rd, Intel Capital agreed to invest 1,894.5 crore for 0.39%. On July 12th, Qualcomm Ventures committed 730 crore for 0.15%, explicitly tying its rationale to support for advanced 5G infrastructure and services. And on July 15th came Google, announcing a 33,737 crore investment for a 7.73% stake and a commercial agreement to jointly develop an affordable entry-level smartphone optimized for Android and the Play Store for India. By July 30, Reliance said Jio Platforms had raised 152,056 crore from 13 investors, and that Reliance would retain 66.48% equity on a fully diluted basis after completion. Reuters reported that Jio Platforms had raised around $10 billion in 6 weeks, even before the Google deal, and the company itself described the full 2020 capital raise as unprecedented in India's history. It was hard to find a comparable corporate fundraising blitz of similar size and speed carried out under the shadow of a global lockdown. The sequence of investor types tells its own story. Strategic technology players came in, global private equity specialists came in, sovereign wealth funds came in, semiconductor and wireless technology investors came in. Each class of investors saw something slightly different. Facebook saw distribution and commerce potential through WhatsApp. Google saw smartphone adoption, Android reach, and digital access. Qualcomm saw 5G infrastructure opportunities. Intel could see enterprise, cloud, and digital scale. Private equity firms saw a platform asset with a possibility of long-duration dominance. Sovereign funds saw exposure to a foundational digital growth engine in one of the world's largest markets. This is why the fundraising changed Jio's identity in the eyes of the market. Telecom companies raise capital all the time, but when the capital comes from this array of investors, on this timetable, with explicit reference to commerce, cloud, devices, digital services, and 5G, it becomes impossible to pretend the asset is still being read as a narrow carrier. The market was voting, in cash, for the infrastructure thesis. The Google deal deserves special attention. Facebook had validated the messaging commerce angle, private equity had validated the platform valuation, Google validated the device and operating system flank, which had always been one of the most important pieces of the Indian digital puzzle. Google described the transaction as the first investment from its India Digitization Fund. More than that, Google and Jio said they would jointly develop an affordable, entry-level smartphone optimized for Android and the Play Store. Even after years of explosive data growth, India remained a market where smartphone ownership constraints limited who could fully participate online. Reliance's own reporting noted that JioPhone had already transitioned roughly 100 million former feature phone users to the 4G network, but millions of 2G users still remained. There was another strategic beauty to the partnership.
Android already dominated the global smartphone operating system landscape, including India. Yet affordable smartphones are not simply about OS market share. They are about price points, local optimization, distribution, and mass trust. Jio had shown with the Jio phone that it could re-engineer affordability and market access. Bringing Google into the fold suggested an ambition to repeat that feat for the low-cost smartphone segment. Google's investment also demonstrated that Jio could attract not just financial capital, but strategic alignment from multiple global technology giants whose interests were not identical. That mattered symbolically. Jio was strong enough to sit at the center and make different global firms compete to be useful to it. By mid-2020, Jio Platforms had assembled a coalition that spanned social communications, search and operating systems, semiconductors, wireless technology, growth private equity, and sovereign capital. Few companies in the world could command that sort of cross-domain endorsement. Fewer still could do it while retaining promoter control. Control was central to the playbook. After the fundraising cycle, Reliance would still hold 66.48% on a fully diluted basis. Global investors could validate and help accelerate the platform, but Mukesh Ambani would remain the architect of how the machine evolved. That promoter continuity mattered because the strategy itself depended on relentless integration across telecom, media, retail, cloud, and commerce. Fragmented control would have made the project far less coherent.
It would be too simple to read all this as a straightforward victory. The challenge of turning platform possibility into platform economics remained immense. Building affordable smartphones is hard. Converting merchant digitization into sustainable commerce profits is hard. Turning consumer scale into durable, high-margin digital businesses is hard. The Google smartphone partnership, for instance, took longer to deliver products at scale than initial announcements suggested. Several of the Jio phone iterations underperformed against rival low-cost Android devices. The JioMart WhatsApp commerce integration, while significant, did not immediately produce the kind of transformative volumes that some 2020 commentary anticipated, and Reliance Retail's commerce ambitions would face hard competition in subsequent years. But the significance of 2020 was that Jio no longer had to argue that these possibilities were fanciful. The market had accepted them as plausible enough to fund lavishly. The story did not need to be finished. It needed to become financeable. By the time Google joined the cap table, Jio Platforms had crossed that threshold. Why did sophisticated investors begin to regard Jio as digital infrastructure? The answer lies in a set of overlapping characteristics that, taken together, made Jio feel less like a product and more like a foundational layer. The first was scale with habit. By March 2020, Jio had 387.5 million mobile subscribers, and by the end of June 2020, it had reached 398.3 million. Users consumed enormous quantities of data and voice. A platform that combines massive scale with heavy habitual use begins to resemble infrastructure because other businesses can reliably build around its user behavior. The second was breadth of application. Jio was not offering one service to one segment. It was extending from wireless broadband to home broadband, enterprise and SMB connectivity, cloud-linked services through Microsoft, narrowband IoT, media apps, content aggregation, security, healthcare, meetings, education use cases, and commerce. The third was control over the access point. Jio understood that whoever controls the first affordable door into the internet can influence much of what follows. The Jio phone strategy and later the Google smartphone partnership reflected an obsession with this access layer. The fourth was integration with the physical economy. Through JioMart, WhatsApp, local merchants, home broadband installations, cable operator relationships, and retail partnerships, Reliance aimed to connect digital services to the daily rhythms of Indian commerce. Infrastructure is powerful not because it is abstractly technological, but because it becomes difficult for ordinary life to proceed without it. The fifth was data center and cloud adjacency. Jio's alliance with Microsoft and its plans for data centers in Gujarat and Maharashtra suggested a future in which the company would not simply connect users to the internet, but also host and power more of the workloads and services used by Indian enterprises. The sixth was content and attention. Through Network 18, Viacom 18 related assets, Voot, Money Control, News 18, and Geo's own apps and aggregation services, Reliance could shape what users did once they were connected. The seventh was financial structure. Creating Geo platforms as a debt-free holding company for digital assets made it legible as a strategic platform rather than as a debt-heavy operating subsidiary. The eighth was promoter credibility. Mukesh Ambani had already demonstrated an ability to conceive, finance, and operationalize projects of intimidating scale. Investors were betting not only on a static asset, but on a system steered by a promoter they believed could keep integrating new layers over time. When all these traits are assembled, the infrastructure thesis becomes easier to understand. Geo was infrastructure because it was becoming the indispensable substrate across multiple categories of Indian digital life. There is an irony here. For years, telecom had often been treated as a low-glamour sector whose heroic era was over. Platforms, software, and internet companies were supposed to sit at the top of the value chain while carriers slogged underneath them. Reliance's answer was to use telecom as the launch rail for a wider bid to capture platform economics. Geo thus turned a supposedly low-status sector into the base camp for a much grander ascent. Skeptics could and did ask whether all these ambitions would convert into profits commensurate with the valuations implied by the fundraising. That was a fair question. Scale does not automatically become monetization. Yet the crucial shift had already occurred. Geo was now being judged by the standards applied to national digital champions, not only to telecom incumbents. By the end of 2020, Reliance had not completed its digital empire, but it had made the empire undeniable. Historians looking backward are tempted to overstate inevitability. Geo in 2020 was still in motion. Many of its promised adjacencies remained to be proven in hard commercial terms. The integration of messaging and commerce would face friction. Affordable smartphone collaborations would take time. Media strategies would evolve. Home broadband, cloud, and enterprise services would have to mature. What had happened was that Reliance had transformed the meaning of Geo. In 2017, Geo still needed to prove that it could absorb the excluded feature phone masses into a 4G ecosystem. It answered with the Geo phone, and with pricing that turned internet access from a privilege into a near assumption. In 2018 and 2019, it expanded from mobile disruption into a broader platform architecture, combining massive subscriber growth with 5G-ready network design, home broadband, enterprise ambitions, IoT, cloud partnerships, and an increasingly explicit digital services stack. In 2020, under the harsh light of a global pandemic, Geo's relevance became more visible rather than less. Then came the restructuring into Geo platforms, the breathtaking fundraising campaign, the net debt-free announcement, and the capstone of Google's entry. Empire here should not be heard as a metaphor for size alone. It refers to a system in which multiple provinces, each with their own logic, are held together by common infrastructure, common capital, and a governing center capable of making them reinforce one another. Telecom, media, commerce, devices, cloud, and finance were becoming provinces of a single imperial design. For India, the implications were enormous. Reliance was not merely participating in digitization, it was trying to shape the form digitization would take, who would mediate it, and how value would be captured from it. In a country with hundreds of millions of aspiring digital consumers and millions of small merchants and enterprises still early in their digital journey, that was a bid for structural power. For global investors, the attraction was clear. India offered scale. Geo offered a route into that scale through an asset that seemed to sit at the junction of connectivity, commerce, software, and future digital services. For Reliance itself, the achievement was more intimate. It had managed to turn a capital-intensive gamble that once looked to many observers like overreach into a platform credible enough to refinance the parent, reset the balance sheet, and reframe the group's future. The Geo build-out had become the engine of a new corporate identity. This was not the end of the story. It was the end of the argument over what kind of story it was. The Green Pivot, 2021 to 2024. There was always something faintly theatrical about the idea that Reliance Industries would one day try to engineer its own escape from hydrocarbons. This was, after all, the company that had spent decades mastering the old energy order in India. It had climbed from textiles into petrochemicals, from petrochemicals to refining, and from refining into one of the most formidable oil-to-chemical systems in the world. Jamnagar, the monumental industrial complex on Gujarat's coast, had become a kind of secular cathedral of scale, a place where crude oil arrived from across the world and emerged as fuels, chemicals, polymers, and cash flow. That history is what made the Green Pivot so interesting. When Mukesh Ambani began speaking seriously in 2021 about solar, batteries, green hydrogen, fuel cells, carbon capture, and a net carbon zero target for 2035, the announcement could not be understood as a clean moral conversion. It was the story of an empire examining its own succession plan. The company that became rich by mastering the hydrocarbon age was now trying to make sure it would also matter after that age began to bend. It was attempting to use the cash, capabilities, land, logistics, engineering discipline, and scale of the old order to seize the commanding heights of the next one. A note on numbers, because this chapter sits at the intersection of official announcements and journalistic shorthand. In popular summaries, Mukesh Ambani's green push is often described as a $75 or even $80 billion ambition. That larger framing comes from the broader capital program disclosed in January 2022 for Gujarat, in which Reliance said it would invest 5 trillion rupees over 10 to 15 years to build a 100-gigawatt renewable energy power plant and green hydrogen ecosystem within a wider 5.95 trillion rupee package that also included retail and telecom spending. The more precise starting point for the Green Pivot was the 2021 AGM, where Ambani laid out an initial internal commitment of 75,000 crore, or a little over $10 billion at the time, to be spent over 3 years on the new energy business. Both figures are real. They describe different rings of the same strategy.
To understand why Reliance chose this moment, one must begin not with Reliance itself, but with India's energy predicament. India was already the world's third largest energy consumer, and its energy demand had roughly doubled since 2000. Much of that demand was still met by coal, oil, and traditional biomass. Energy had to become cheaper for a country still climbing the income ladder. It had to become cleaner for a country with brutal pollution and rising climate vulnerability. And it had to become more secure for a country whose growth exposed it to imported fossil fuels, maritime choke points, and geopolitical risk. India could not simply moralize its way out of hydrocarbons. It had to industrialize its way out. This distinction is essential because Mukesh Ambani's green narrative was never built primarily around guilt. It was built around cost curves, manufacturing localization, energy sovereignty, and the possibility that India might eventually move from being a major importer of energy to a competitive exporter of green electrons and green molecules. When Ambani addressed shareholders at the 2021 AGM, he tried to present the coming shift in almost civilizational terms. The world, he argued, was entering a new energy era. Fossil fuels had powered prosperity for centuries, but the carbon consequences were now intolerable. Reliance, he said, would respond by building a Dhirubhai-Ambani green energy gigacomplex across 5,000 acres in Jamnagar. The symbolism of the location was impossible to miss. Jamnagar had been the cradle of the old energy business. Now it would become the cradle of the new one. The first architecture was startlingly simple. Reliance would build 4 gigafactories. One would make integrated solar photovoltaic modules, one would produce advanced energy storage batteries, one would manufacture electrolyzers for green hydrogen, one would produce fuel cells for motive and stationary power. Over the next 3 years, Ambani said, Reliance would invest more than 60,000 crore rupees in these 4 initiatives and an additional 15,000 crore rupees in value chain investments, partnerships and future technologies. That combined amount, 75,000 crore rupees, became the foundational number of the new energy program. The vision was not to own a few scattered assets in fashionable sectors. It was to create a fully integrated, end-to-end renewable energy ecosystem with manufacturing depth and system-level economics. The company wanted to replicate the logic that had defined its rise in petrochemicals and refining. Go upstream, go downstream, capture margins, protect supply, and use scale to drive down cost. In solar, the logic was to move from silica to polysilicon, from polysilicon to ingots and wafers, from wafers to cells, from cells to modules. In batteries, it was to move from materials into cells, packs, battery management systems, and eventually recycling. In hydrogen, it was to reduce the cost of renewable power and the cost of electrolysis at the same time. What followed was a burst of deal-making that made clear Reliance did not intend to start from scratch where time could be bought. In August 2021, Reliance New Energy Solar invested $50 million in Ambri, the American long-duration energy storage company whose liquid metal battery systems promised durability and long life in grid-scale applications. Intermittent renewable power is only as useful as the system that can stabilize it, shift it, or buffer it. Long-duration storage represented an industrial adjacency, not a sideshow. In October 2021, Reliance announced one of the defining acquisitions of the early green pivot, the purchase of REC Solar Holdings for an enterprise value of $771 million. REC brought brand credibility in global solar markets, technology, manufacturing know-how, and a ready-made international platform. Reliance said it would use REC's technology for its fully integrated metallic silicon-to-panel gigafactory in Jamnagar, beginning with an initial annual capacity of 4 gigawatts and eventually scaling to 10 gigawatts. The same October week brought another move that looked modest only to those who missed the system's logic. Reliance New Energy arm would acquire up to 40% of Sterling and Wilson Solar, one of the world's important solar engineering, procurement, and construction players. Solar panels are one thing, the ability to deploy, manage, and operate solar projects at scale is another. Sterling and Wilson gave Reliance execution muscle in project delivery and operations and maintenance. That same period also saw an investment in Germany's Nextwave. Reuters reported that Reliance would buy preferred shares worth roughly €25 million, gaining access to proprietary wafer technology and planning to build large-scale wafer manufacturing facilities in India using Nextwave's process. Wafer manufacturing is one of the technological choke points in the solar chain. If Reliance could localize that layer, it would have greater control over cost, quality, and import dependence. Reliance also partnered with Denmark's Stiesdal to commercialize hydrogen electrolyzer technology, tying the partnership directly to its 1-1-1 target for green hydrogen, $1 per kilogram within 1 decade. This was an audacious benchmark, perhaps deliberately theatrical, but the point was not merely public relations. Green hydrogen economics are brutal. By setting a dramatic target, Ambani was signaling that Reliance meant to attack the economics, not simply participate in the discourse. At the very end of 2021, Reliance moved on batteries again by signing definitive agreements to acquire Faradion, the British sodium-ion battery company, for an enterprise value of £100 million with an additional £25 million of growth capital. Sodium-ion chemistry had lower energy density than some lithium-based alternatives, but sodium was abundant, costs could be lower, and the technology carried promise in stationary storage and certain mobility applications.
Reliance was assembling optionality across chemistries, a portfolio approach that matched the scale and uncertainty of the transition. In March 2022, Reliance deepened the battery stack further by acquiring the assets of Lithium Works for $61 million, including a broad LFP-related patent portfolio, a manufacturing facility in China, and related business contracts. LFP, or lithium iron phosphate, had already begun its resurgence globally because it reduced dependence on more expensive or geopolitically sensitive materials such as cobalt and nickel. This acquisition blitz did two things. It compressed time, since Reliance did not have to wait for purely internal R&D to climb the learning curve in every relevant subsector, and it internationalized the green pivot from birth. The new energy project was rooted in Jamnagar and aimed at Indian cost structures, but the technology arteries ran through Norway, Singapore, Germany, Denmark, Britain, the United States, and China. Reliance was building a sovereign Indian manufacturing ambition using a global shopping cart. By the time of the 2022 AGM, the green pivot had moved from declaration to industrial sketching. Ambani's presentation that year felt less like a grand thesis and more like a set of engineering notes delivered to the public. He described REC's technology roadmap, including the intention to improve heterojunction module efficiency and push further through perovskite innovation. He said the 10-gigawatt solar PV cell and module factory at Jamnagar would commence production by 2024 and scale in phases to 20 gigawatts annually by 2026. He described the facility as a first-of-its-kind quartz-to-module plant. Reliance would invest not only in the obvious manufacturing steps, but also in adjacent materials like glass and POE film, both of which had natural synergies with the company's chemicals and materials operations. New energy at Reliance was meant to lock into the existing business, not float above it. The chemical complex would feed the solar complex. The materials know-how of the old business would reduce the cost structure of the new one. On batteries, Ambani laid out a staged ramp. Reliance aimed to begin battery pack production by 2023, build a fully integrated 5-gigawatt-hour annual cell-to-pack manufacturing facility by 2024, and scale further to 50 gigawatt-hours by 2027. He explicitly linked the effort to partnerships with Lithium Works, Veradian, and Ambri, each representing a different technological line in the broader storage landscape. The hydrogen section of the 2022 AGM tied the green pivot directly back to Reliance's hydrocarbon inheritance. Ambani reminded shareholders that Reliance was already one of the world's largest producers of gray hydrogen. Green hydrogen did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged as a prospective successor to a hydrogen stream the company already understood in its fossil-derived form. Reliance said it had partnered with Stiesdal on pressurized alkaline electrolyzer technology and was in advanced discussions with other players to set up gigascale electrolyzer manufacturing at Jamnagar. The aim was to begin transitioning from gray hydrogen to green hydrogen by 2025, once cost and performance targets were proven. This was perhaps the most strategically elegant part of the green pivot. Hydrogen was a bridge between the old industrial system and the new one. The company already knew how to handle hydrogen, already had captive demand, already had process discipline, already possessed desalination expertise at an industrial site. If green hydrogen could be competitive, Reliance would not need to search desperately for demand. It could internalize early demand within its system, learn by doing, and later sell outward. The 2022 AGM also revealed another crucial feature of the strategy: captive consumption. Reliance said it would establish 20 gigawatts of solar energy generation capacity by 2025, entirely for its own round-the-clock power needs and for green hydrogen. This created a guaranteed baseload demand for the manufacturing ecosystem and reduced the risk of building scale before customers arrived. It also made the new energy build-out immediately relevant to the profitability of the legacy businesses. Ambani also highlighted the inauguration of Phase 1 of the Bioenergy Technology Center at Jamnagar on August 15, 2022. India produces enormous volumes of agricultural residue and organic waste. Reliance was already one of the largest users of agro-waste as fuel for captive energy. The company was therefore not limiting its decarbonization imagination to photovoltaics and electrolysis. By 2023, the tone of the project had shifted. In 2021, it had sounded like a manifesto. In 2022, it sounded like a blueprint. In 2023, it began to sound like an operating thesis about India's future. At the AGM that year, Ambani framed the opportunity through what he called the energy trilemma: affordability, sustainability, and security. For India, he argued, green energy had the potential to answer all three. That argument served multiple purposes. It aligned the project with Indian industrial policy and with public goals broader than shareholder value. It also repositioned the green pivot away from the potentially threatening idea that decarbonization would destroy the company's hydrocarbon cash engine. Ambani was increasingly explicit that the clean energy shift would not mean abandoning the oil-to-chemicals business. Reuters reported in 2023 that Reliance intended to switch to 100% green energy for captive consumption, cut energy costs, and progressively operate the Jamnagar refining complex as a chemicals and materials feedstock production engine. The company was not saying goodbye to molecules. It was repricing them, repositioning them, and trying to move them up the value ladder. This is where the phrase engineering its own succession away from hydrocarbons becomes especially useful. Succession does not mean patricide. The old business was not being denounced. It was being prepared for a different role. Fuels would matter less over time, chemicals and advanced materials more. Electrons and green molecules would increasingly sit beside hydrocarbons, and where economical, displace part of their role. The refinery would not be dynamited. It would be repurposed, integrated, and strategically surrounded. Operationally, the 2023 AGM supplied more proof points. Ambani said the company remained focused on fast-track execution of the Dhirubhai Ambani Green Energy Giga Manufacturing Complex at Jamnagar. The first priority remained a fully integrated solar PV ecosystem, converting sand into modules at a single location, with module, cell, wafer, ingot, polysilicon, and glass all manufacturing clustered together. The target was to bring the factory on stream in phases by the end of 2025 using heterojunction technology. Ambani also disclosed that Reliance would pursue wind power generation and had made significant progress in the manufacturing ecosystem needed to deliver wind at cost-efficient scale. The carbon fiber platform under development in Hazira re-entered the picture. Carbon fiber is a major cost driver for wind blades, and Reliance's ability to produce it at scale could reduce turbine costs. On green hydrogen, Ambani said Reliance now had a roadmap towards its targeted electrolyzer and hydrogen costs, would demonstrate at megawatt scale first, and then would set up a fully integrated automated gigascale electrolyzer manufacturing facility. That facility would support large-scale hydrogen production at Jamnagar, gradual transition of captive needs, and integration with green ammonia and green methanol for both domestic and international markets. Bioenergy became an early commercial example of execution rather than just intent. After 2 demo compressed biogas units at Jamnagar, Reliance said it had commissioned its first commercial-scale CBG plant at Barabanki in Uttar Pradesh in just 10 months. It planned to scale to 25 plants across India and target 100 CBG plants within 5 years. The broader policy environment helped make this strategy more plausible. India launched the National Green Hydrogen Mission in January 2023 with an initial outlay of 19,744 crore rupees. The solar manufacturing PLI scheme carried an outlay of 24,000 crore rupees. These signals from the Indian state were not small nudges. The state wanted domestic capacity in the very sectors Reliance was targeting. The year 2024 was when the green pivot began to feel less like an eloquent plan and more like a visible industrial build-out.
Reliance's integrated annual report for 2023-24 said the first train of module and cell manufacturing would be commissioned in FY25 and that Jamnagar-made solar panels had already obtained BIS certification. The company said it had been allotted land in Gujarat for renewable energy development, aimed to become the largest renewable energy developer in India, and had already signed its first power purchase agreement with MSEDCL for 128 megawatts over 25 years. It also disclosed a 50 megawatt-hour per year pilot line for lithium battery cells through Lithium Works, qualification under the government's PLI scheme for manufacturing 300 MWe of electrolyzers annually and producing 90 kilotons per annum of green hydrogen, and an MOU with the government of Maharashtra for 100 kilotons per annum of green hydrogen production with an estimated investment of around 15,000 crore rupees. These disclosures mattered because together they demonstrated motion across multiple layers: manufacturing, standards certification, land, generation, long-term offtake, pilot production, incentives, and geographic expansion. Reliance was turning nouns into verbs. Reuters added further granularity in August 2024, reporting that Reliance would start production of ingots and wafers at its 10-gigawatt solar PV gigafactory in Jamnagar by December and aimed to double the plant's capacity by 2026. Ingots and wafers sit upstream of modules and cells and represent exactly the kind of manufacturing depth that India has historically struggled to internalize at scale. At the 2024 AGM, Ambani's language became even more expansive, but also more operational. He said a fully automated multi-gigawatt electrolyzer manufacturing facility on the west coast of India would be ready by 2026 and would be adaptable across alkaline, PEM, and AEM technologies. He said Jamnagar would become the cradle of the new energy business by 2025 and that the green energy giga manufacturing complex would be the world's largest and most integrated ecosystem at a single location. He said Reliance was on track to fully commit and invest up to 75,000 crore rupees in this manufacturing ecosystem. Then, Ambani unveiled the next territorial layer of the strategy. Reliance had leased arid wasteland in Kutch, roughly 250 kilometers from Jamnagar, with the potential to generate about 150 billion units of electricity over the next 10 years, or nearly 10% of India's energy requirements. The company had begun building its own transmission infrastructure to bring round-the-clock renewable energy online at gigawatt scale in phases beginning in 2026. It had also secured access to nearly 2,000 acres at Kandla Port, complementing Jamnagar's marine infrastructure and giving it an advantage in producing, storing, evacuating, and shipping green fuels. This was the moment the broader $75 billion mythology made the most sense. The initial 75,000 crore rupee manufacturing ecosystem was one thing, but once Reliance started discussing Kutch land, transmission infrastructure, port logistics, green fuel exports, state MOUs, and multi-year generation buildouts, the program clearly expanded into a far larger industrial geography. Jamnagar was the heart, but the circulatory system now stretched into Kutch, Kandla, Maharashtra, and even Australia through an MOU with Brookfield on renewable power and decarbonization equipment manufacturing. Solar modules, batteries, and electrolyzers are only part of the value chain. Land, transmission, ports, water, and offtake are often the true bottlenecks. A refinery is not just a reactor and some steel. It is pipelines, ports, feedstock contracts, utility systems, storage, shipping, and scheduling. The same mindset was now being applied to green power and green fuels. By 2024, Ambani also sounded confident enough to speak of future profitability. At the AGM, he listed reasons why the prospects of perpetual growth and profitability in new energy were assured: captive demand across group businesses over the next 5 to 7 years, value-accretive offtake agreements for green fuels, short gestation periods that can produce cash flow positive projects from day one, margin expansion through next-generation products, and organizational design built around task force teams and global talent. Then he made the leap from confidence to ambition. The new energy business, he said, could aim in the next 5 to 7 years to deliver an earning capacity comparable to what the oil-to-chemicals business earned after 40 years of building. That was a breathtaking claim. It may ultimately prove too optimistic, yet its importance lay not in the precision of the forecast, but in what it revealed about Reliance's own internal framing. The green pivot was being described as the sixth great growth engine of the group, and perhaps the next jewel in the crown.
There is another dimension to the period from 2021 to 2024 that should not be missed: family succession. In 2023, Mukesh Ambani brought his children, Isha, Akash, and Anant, onto the board as directors. The company was transferring responsibility to the next generation of family leadership while also trying to transfer the group's center of gravity over time toward businesses more resilient in a decarbonizing world. The green pivot was therefore not just an industrial succession plan, it was also part of a dynastic one. An empire planning for continuity cannot hand its heirs only yesterday's assets. This helps explain why the project was never framed as anti-hydrocarbon in a crude or performative way. Mukesh Ambani knows better than most that hydrocarbons still finance a great deal of India's present and a great deal of Reliance's optionality. Even in 2023, Reuters reported his assurance that the global clean energy shift would not hit Reliance's oil business the way some outsiders imagined. The company's strategy was to make existing assets safer and more profitable even as fossil demand waned, lower energy costs by greening captive consumption, and upgrade refinery output toward value-added chemicals. The carbon capture and utilization side of the story fits this pattern. Reliance's reports in this period repeatedly referred to using CO2 as feedstock, converting emissions into useful products, and developing next-generation carbon capture and storage technologies. By 2023 to 2024, the company was describing research into concentrated CO2 streams at Jamnagar, biological pathways for converting CO2 into proteins, biofuels, and advanced materials, CCUS pathways such as synthetic fuels and construction materials, collaboration with IIT Madras, a stable catalyst for turning methanol and CO2 into dimethyl carbonate, and a patented process for concentrating CO2 from dilute flue gases. Some of this remained developmental and aspirational rather than commercial at scale, but the strategic intention was clear. The green pivot should not be understood merely as diversification. Diversification suggests adding a new wing. What Reliance was attempting was closer to industrial transmutation. The company was trying to turn old capabilities into new relevance. Project management from refinery building would be reused in gigafactory construction. Materials expertise from chemicals would be reused in solar, batteries, and wind. Hydrogen know-how from gray hydrogen production would be reused in green hydrogen. Ports, desalination, utilities, and logistics would be reused in green fuel exports. Captive power demand from industrial operations would be reused as the launch customer for renewable generation. That does not mean the risks were small. Technology risk is one. The company has taken positions across heterojunction solar, perovskites, alkaline electrolyzers, potentially multiple electrolyzer chemistries, LFP batteries, sodium-ion batteries, liquid metal storage, fuel cells, carbon fiber, bioenergy, and CCUS. Some of these bets will work better than others. Some may become stranded. Some may be overtaken by other process innovations or by brutal price competition. Manufacturing depth can be a strength, but in industries where learning curves are steep and Chinese overcapacity can crush margins, it can also become a trap. Execution risk is another. Reliance is famous for execution, but new energy manufacturing has its own distinct challenges. precision yields in photovoltaics, electrochemical reliability in batteries, stack durability in electrolyzers, system integration for round-the-clock renewable energy, land and grid bottlenecks, water management, and the sequencing of production with demand. A refinery does not make a sodium-ion chemistry work by sheer force of will. Several of the announced timelines through 2023 and 2024 had already slipped relative to the 2021 plan. The original target to begin transitioning from gray to green hydrogen by 2025 looked unlikely on schedule, and the cost trajectory toward the 111 target remained more aspiration than visible engineering reality. Market risk also remains substantial. Green hydrogen has been one of the most over-narrated sectors in the global energy transition. Many announced projects may never become economic at scale. Off-take markets can be slower to develop than press releases imply. Carbon pricing regimes, trade rules, subsidies, and export standards may change. Then there is the geopolitical question. Reliance's acquisition of Lithium Works, including assets in China, and its use of global partnerships rather than pure domestic invention, reveals that the path to industrial sovereignty is messy. Localization is an aspiration, but industrial interdependence remains a fact. For all those caveats, the most striking thing about the 2021 to 2024 period is how coherent the green pivot became. Many conglomerates announce energy transition goals. Fewer build a legible industrial doctrine around them. Reliance did. The doctrine rested on a few recurring ideas. India needs abundant, affordable, clean energy. Localized manufacturing matters. Integration beats fragmentation. Captive demand can de-risk early scale. Old energy capabilities can support new energy economics, and Jamnagar, rather than being abandoned as a relic, can be refitted as the platform from which the next era is launched. Dhirubhai Ambani built Reliance by reading scarcity better than others. Mukesh Ambani built Jamnagar by reading scale better than others. The green pivot suggests he hopes to build Reliance's next chapter by reading transition better than others. Not by moving first in a pure venture sense, and not by pretending the hydrocarbon era has already ended, but by concluding that the companies most likely to shape the transition are those with enough industrial muscle to survive the messy middle. The path from crude oil to green hydrogen does not run through moral purity. It runs through land, steel, wafers, catalysts, ports, power lines, factories, and patient capital. Between 2021 and 2024, the company did not complete its escape from hydrocarbons. It did something more realistic and perhaps more important. It began to design a plausible route by which a hydrocarbon empire might reproduce itself in altered form. It announced an initial 75,000 crore rupee build-out, then a broader multi-trillion rupee regional program. It created a Jamnagar-centered gigafactory architecture. It bought technology, talent, brands, and process know-how across solar, storage, and hydrogen. It used policy tailwinds without depending solely on them. It tried to make captive demand a launchpad, and by 2024, it was beginning to turn drawings into assets. For years, critics of large fossil-linked conglomerates have argued that the incumbents of the old energy world are too compromised, too culturally attached to hydrocarbons, or too financially dependent on legacy cash flows ever to lead the transition. Often, those criticisms are fair. But Reliance's 2021 to 2024 story suggests a harder truth. Incumbents may be late, compromised, and self-interested, but they also possess the one thing the transition eventually demands in terrifying quantities, which is industrial capacity. The moral drama of climate change has made heroes of startups and activists, and rightly so in many contexts. Yet the physical work of rewriting an energy system still runs through land acquisition, megawatt hours, material science, desalination, Ports, long-term contracts, localization ratios, manufacturing yields, and project execution. Those are not romantic words. They are empire words. Reliance speaks them fluently. Reliance's wager from 2021 to 2024 was that it could be one of the firms that learns to industrialize the new energy system with the least friction. The company was not trying to become morally unrecognizable, it was trying to remain structurally indispensable. The acquisitions were real, the capital commitments were real, the factory plans were real, the land, port access, pilot lines, PPAs, policy participation, and technology partnerships were real. So were the unresolved risks and the possibility of overreach. But history often turns less on perfect certainty than on whether an institution understands the shape of the next battlefield early enough to start digging. Between 2021 and 2024, Reliance dug. Dynasty in transition, 2024 to 2026. There is a particular kind of drama that visits great family empires in their third act. The first act is hunger. A founder sees routes others miss, moves faster than older institutions, and assembles a fortune through nerve, timing, and audacity. The second act is scale. Trading becomes factories, refineries, fiber, stores, towers, data centers, media rights, logistics, and political fluency. The founder stops being merely rich and becomes infrastructural. The third act is the dangerous one. It asks whether genius can be taught, whether instinct can be systematized, and whether a structure built around one commanding intelligence can survive the day that intelligence no longer sits at the center of every decision. That is where Reliance Industries now stands. By the spring of 2026, Mukesh Ambani's conglomerate is not fragile. Reliance remains one of India's most powerful corporate organisms, spanning oil to chemicals, refinery, telecom, digital services, retail, media, and a still unfolding new energy complex at Jamnagar. For the financial year ended March 2025, the company reported consolidated revenue of roughly 10.7 lakh crore rupees, EBITDA of about 1.83 lakh crore rupees, and profit after tax of around 81,000 crore rupees. Consumer-facing businesses had grown so large that digital services, retail, and related operations together contributed more than half of consolidated EBITDA. The succession problem was no longer about passing on a refinery empire. It was about passing on a multi-engine system, and yet the old core still mattered enormously. Reliance's oil-to-chemicals complex remained the single largest revenue engine, even as earnings there softened. Jamnagar still sat at the heart of the machine, inhaling crude and exhaling cash, fuels, feedstocks, and strategic optionality. The legacy engine was not disappearing, it was underwriting the future. The clearest single image of the current Reliance paradox came in December 2024, when the company entered a long-term arrangement with Rosneft to procure nearly 500,000 barrels of crude a day for 10 years, with an option to extend. A company publicly evangelizing solar, green hydrogen, batteries, data centers, and AI was simultaneously signing one of the largest oil supply arrangements in modern Indo-Russian trade. The contradiction was not accidental, it was the strategy. And it is the right place to begin a chapter on succession because the Rosneft deal exposes both what Mukesh Ambani has built and what his heirs will have to manage. Reuters reported that the agreement was worth roughly $13 billion annually at prevailing prices and represented about half of Rosneft's seaborne oil exports from Russian ports. For Reliance, the oil was meant for the Jamnagar complex, the largest refining complex in the world. The deal followed a smaller arrangement earlier in 2024, under which Reliance had agreed to purchase at least 3 million barrels a month from Rosneft. Why would a company proclaiming a green energy future do that? Because succession rhetoric does not change industrial arithmetic. Jamnagar remains one of the greatest strategic assets in the Ambani system. Its size, flexibility, export orientation, and integration into chemicals and trading make it more than a refinery. It is a cash engine, a geopolitical instrument, and a source of optionality. When discounted Russian crude became available after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Indian refiners emerged as major buyers. Reliance, with its scale and sophisticated crude slate management, was especially well positioned to benefit. The Rosneft deal was the financing logic beneath the green pivot. The old hydrocarbon machine was being asked to underwrite the new energy build, the data center build, and the broader consumer expansion. Reliance was not renouncing fossil capital, it was trying to transmute it. But the strategy also imported geopolitical risk directly into the succession era. By early 2026, that risk had become obvious. Reuters reported in January that Reliance was not expecting Russian crude deliveries that month after stricter US and EU sanctions and broader political pressure complicated flows. Jamnagar had not received Russian cargoes in roughly 3 weeks and was not expecting any in January. A few weeks later, Reuters reported that Reliance was set to resume receiving sanctions-compliant Russian oil in February and March after a 1-month pause, but only through non-sanctioned sellers. Reliance was having to manage barrels and refinery utilization more carefully to protect sales into Europe, where rules around fuels produced from Russian-origin crude had become stricter. This is the paradox of Jamnagar in the succession era. It is both fortress and exposure. Its size gives Reliance enormous processing power and bargaining leverage, but that same scale makes disruptions in crude sourcing, freight, sanctions, or export access materially important. The refining business remained strong in absolute terms, but it was no longer operating in the smooth post-2022 world in which discounted Russian supply had felt like an effortless windfall. This matters because every succession story becomes a capital allocation story. Mukesh can personally embody contradiction. He can say with credibility that Reliance is building green hydrogen, batteries, solar modules, AI infrastructure, and consumer platforms, while also signing giant crude contracts because he sees them as parts of one industrial arc. The question is whether the institution can preserve that synthesis when others must manage the tensions. Will the next generation be able to navigate a world in which hydrocarbon earnings are politically exposed, yet still indispensable? Can they preserve the financial muscle of Jamnagar without becoming trapped by it? Can they use old energy cash to build future industries quickly enough that the center of gravity truly shifts? These are not abstract questions. They live inside operating choices every month. Which crude grades should be secured and through whom? How should refinery runs be split when sanctions affect downstream sales? How much capital should continue flowing into optimizing oil to chemicals versus accelerating solar, batteries, or electrolyzers? How much geopolitical risk can investors be asked to tolerate while also being sold a story about AI-ready data centers and green hydrogen?
Mukesh Ambani has not framed Reliance as private property to be handed down like jewelry in a velvet case. He has spoken of trusteeship, institution building, and self-renewal. At the 2024 annual general meeting, he said he and Nita Ambani regarded themselves as trustees, not owners, and described Akash, Isha, and Anant as taking greater responsibility as first among equals in the next generation of leadership. At the 2025 annual general meeting, he said the next generation leaders had completed 2 transformative years on the board and were fully embedded in operations and decision-making, supported by senior leaders and independent directors. That last phrase did important work. It signaled the real design of the transition. The third generation would be visible, but not alone. Reliance would remain family-led, yet increasingly defended by committees, professional executives, formal governance, and operating systems too complex to be run as a private court. Mukesh understood the danger because he had lived through the alternative. After Dhirubhai Ambani's death in 2002, the absence of a clear succession framework helped produce the rupture with Anil Ambani that split the empire in 2005. Every later move by Mukesh must be read against that trauma. He is not merely trying to preserve value, he is trying to prevent history from rhyming. That is why the transition has been choreographed to emphasize both clarity and overlap. Clarity, because each child is publicly linked to a strategic zone. Overlap, because none of those zones is presented as a private fief. Akash chairs Reliance Jio Infocom. Isha sits at the top layer of the retail empire as an executive director of Reliance Retail Ventures. Anant moved into an executive director role at the parent, while taking a more public role in oil to chemicals, capital projects, sustainability, and new energy. The harder question is whether their arrival marks the maturing of an institution or merely a dynastic pageant arranged by a still dominant patriarch. The answer lies not in slogans, but in structure. Who controls operating decisions, where capital is going, how the old energy system funds the new one, where earnings pressure is emerging, and whether Mukesh's gift for integration can be turned into process rather than personal magic. By FY 2024-25, Reliance was no longer a conglomerate whose center of gravity could be described with one word. Oil to chemicals remained enormous, generating roughly rupees 6.27 lakh crore in revenue, but the consumer stack had become immense. Digital services generated value of services and sales of around 1.54 lakh crore and EBITDA of around 65,000 crore. Retail generated gross revenue of about 3.31 lakh crore and EBITDA of around 25,000 crore. Retail store count reached over 19,000, and its registered customer base crossed 349 million. After the Disney-India combination in November 2024, media too became a meaningful component of the wider system. This stitching is what makes Reliance distinctive. A normal conglomerate often resembles a portfolio. Reliance tries to behave more like a metabolic system. The telecom network supports commerce, media, devices, and cloud ambitions. The retail network supports quick commerce, consumer brands, and data capture. The refining and energy complex supports cash generation, feedstock security, export capability, and now the physical platform for solar, batteries, hydrogen, and AI-ready data centers. What Mukesh is trying to bequeath is not just a set of assets, it is an integration doctrine. But integration doctrines are hard to inherit because they often live inside a founder's judgment rather than a formal manual. Mukesh's version has several recurring traits. He scales early and aggressively. He compresses margins in one business to change the economics of a larger arena. He builds hard infrastructure before consensus forms. He thinks in stacks rather than products, and he repeatedly uses one cash-rich engine to subsidize the assembly of another. A founder can do that with unusual coherence because the trade-offs clear through one mind. An institution can only do it if capital allocation, governance, and internal trust are robust enough to keep all the parts moving in concert. The Reliance-Disney media merger completed in India in November 2024 revealed that even during the handoff phase, Mukesh was still enlarging the empire, still using scale to consolidate consumer attention and distribution. He was not freezing the company in place so the heirs could inherit a tidy museum. He was making it larger and more interconnected. That cuts both ways. It gives the next generation more to work with. It also means they are not inheriting settled businesses. They are inheriting moving fronts. Jio is approaching an IPO, but still broadening into AI and cloud. Retail is dominant but faces a consumer market in transition. Media is newly combined and needs integration. New energy is only beginning to prove industrial seriousness. The succession is happening in the middle of expansion. Capex in FY 2025 was over 1.3 lakh crore, spread across all these fronts.
The Rosneft deal also clarified something about how Reliance is training its next generation. The heir most closely associated with the future of new energy, Anant Ambani, is not being raised in a sealed green sandbox. Company materials around his 2025 appointment as executive director describe him as being involved not only in sustainability and the new energy gigafactories, but also in capital projects and the oil-to-chemicals complex, including crude sourcing, refining, downstream operations, supply, and trading exposure. Reliance does not appear to believe the future can be run by people who disdain the past. It is trying to educate its next generation inside the full industrial metabolism. If Reliance's hydrocarbon engine is the old kingdom still paying the bills, Jio is the kingdom the market most wants to value separately. Its rise from 2016 launch to national telecom dominance was one of the defining business stories of modern India. By the mid-2020s, however, the question was no longer whether Jio had achieved scale, it was what kind of thing it had become. Was it fundamentally a telecom utility with some adjacent digital ambitions, or was it truly the platform core of a broader technology empire? That question matters because Akash Ambani's public identity is tied most clearly to Jio. Still, the shorthand that Akash runs Jio obscures the real structure. Mukesh Ambani remains chairman of Jio Platforms, the parent vehicle. Reuters reported in March 2026 that Jio Platforms' CEO is Kiran Thomas, while Akash Ambani is chairman of Reliance Jio Infocom, the flagship telecom operating unit. Family stewardship sits at the strategic apex. Professional management anchors operational continuity. In FY 2025, Jio Platforms generated operating revenue of roughly $13.65 billion, according to Reuters, with about 90% of that coming from telecom. Jio's subscriber base reached 488.2 million by March 2025, with roughly 60% share of India's wireless data traffic. By the quarter ended December 2025, Jio had crossed 515 million subscribers, more than 250 million 5G users, more than 25 million fixed broadband subscribers, and over 10 million Jio air fiber connections. It had become one of the country's great distribution platforms. Distribution at Reliance is never left to remain narrow. Jio Platforms has pushed into AI, cloud, enterprise services, apps, and digital consumer ecosystems. Official communications in 2025 highlighted partnerships with Google around cloud infrastructure and a Jamnagar cloud region. The 2025 annual meeting outlined the creation of Reliance Intelligence to build AI-ready data centers, with Jamnagar as a core site. The quarter ended December 2025 included management discussion of Jio AI Cloud, which had reached around 50 million registered users, alongside consumer AI initiatives such as a Jio Gemini offer. Reuters in 2026 described Jio as diversifying into AI, cloud, and enterprise network services. The company finds a mass distribution moat, then layers new businesses into it. Cheap data became telecom scale became device distribution, home broadband, enterprise connectivity, apps, and now a plausible AI cloud stack. Mukesh did not build Jio simply to own a telecom company. He built it to own digital reach. That is the inheritance around Akash. He is not inheriting a mature toll road. He is inheriting an unresolved argument about what Jio should become. Unresolved arguments create room for leadership differentiation. If Jio were already a settled, slow-growing utility, Akash's role would look merely custodial. Instead, it remains an arena in which technology positioning, capital markets, and platform ambition are all still in motion. Becoming IPO sharpens the test. Reuters reported in March 2026 that Jio Platforms was gearing up to file for a Mumbai listing in what could become India's largest ever stock offering, with no new capital expected to be raised, and the offering primarily enabling shareholder exits. The listing is less about financing survival or basic capex than about valuation, monetization, and market discipline.
Geo has become large enough that listing it is a way of revealing value, creating a separate public currency, and proving that one of Mukesh's giant bets can stand before investors in more self-contained form. The delayed nature of the IPO hints at the difficulty of that proof. Mukesh had once spoken of a listing within 5 years, but the timetable slipped. Geo is both a wonderful story and a complicated asset. Telecom still dominates the revenue mix. AI and cloud ambitions are exciting but early. Any public market narrative will have to answer a simple question: what is the growth engine beyond incremental telecom monetization?
Geo is the part of the Reliance universe most naturally suited to institutionalization because networks and digital platforms produce measurable operating rhythms. Subscriber counts, ARPU, data traffic, home connections, and enterprise adoption all create dashboards that can discipline management. Strong professional executives, such as Kieran Thomas, help create a dual structure in which strategic family leadership does not necessarily imply managerial chaos. Still, founder-linked technology platforms often struggle when they move from insurgent disruption to multi-front maturity. The skills required to build a national challenger are not identical to the skills required to run a profitable, innovation-credible, publicly listed platform over the next decade. If Geo is the cleanest case for cautious optimism, Reliance Retail is the harsher test. Retail is where scale collides with taste, speed, labor intensity, margin pressure, and the volatility of consumer choice. It is not enough to own distribution. One must keep earning preference. Within the structure, Isha Ambani is listed as an executive director of Reliance Retail Ventures, while professional management remains prominent, including managing director V. Subramaniam. The same dual model applies: family visibility at the strategic apex, professional managers for operating continuity. Retail is where continuity is never enough because the environment keeps mutating. The older logic assumed that building a giant offline footprint conferred durable advantage. Reliance did that aggressively and successfully, yet the market moved again. Quick commerce, with delivery windows measured in minutes, changed expectations. Zepto, Blinkit, Swiggy Instamart, Amazon, and Walmart-owned Flipkart intensified pressure. Traditional organized retailers remained disciplined rivals in their own formats. Size alone no longer guarantees advantage. Reliance's response has been characteristically integrative. Reuters reported in early 2026 that Reliance had begun piloting a search and discovery platform designed to integrate physical stores and online experience more tightly. It was also building out quick commerce capabilities, using its existing network to support faster delivery. Earlier Reuters reporting noted Reliance's claim that its quick commerce business was already margin positive because it leveraged its store footprint in ways competitors could not easily replicate. Even so, pressure has been real. Reuters reported that margins in the retail business were trimmed to about 8% in the quarter ended December 2025 from 8.6% a year earlier, reflecting discounting, investment in hyper-local delivery, and a one-off labor code impact. In January 2026, Reuters described Reliance Retail's earnings as disappointing relative to some expectations, citing slower revenue growth than Avenue Supermarts and pressure tied to festival timing, a demerger of the consumer products division, and heavy investment in quick commerce. Isha's remit is therefore deceptively difficult. Leading retail sounds glamorous from a distance. In practice, it means governing a machine where strategy and execution are inseparable. One must think simultaneously about category mix, premiumization, brands, customer experience, digital interfaces, supply chains, store productivity, local delivery economics, and inventory turnover. Retail punishes vanity. You can be stylish in branding and still be beaten by basket economics. Reliance Retail also sits beside a wider consumer ecosystem that includes brands and media. In FY 2025, management described its consumer brands business as the fastest-growing FMCG company in India, with revenue of roughly 11,450 crore rupees, and highlighted partnerships such as Campa's IPL tie-up with JioStar. Retail is a distribution spine for brands, a media monetization surface, and a customer data funnel. That can be a powerful long-term advantage if Isha and the retail team can keep the pieces synchronized. But breadth becomes a burden unless someone can keep the machine coherent. Retail may be the purest test of whether Reliance can institutionalize founder logic. Unlike a refinery, the customer can simply change her mind. Unlike telecom, loyalty is not always underwritten by network dependence. Institutionalizing retail requires more than scale and capital. It requires a culture that can sense change, absorb it, and redirect quickly. Anant Ambani's domain carries a different burden. It is the most symbolic because it is most clearly associated with the future. But if one reads the company's own materials carefully, his role is broader and more demanding than the slogan of green energy air implies. In May 2025, Reliance's board approved Anant Ambani's appointment as a whole-time director and designated executive director of Reliance Industries for 5 years from May 1st. The explanatory materials described someone who had worked across the group since 2015, with exposure to crude sourcing, refinery operations, downstream businesses, supply, trading, capital projects, and new energy. They pointed to tangible milestones: commissioning of a first gigawatt-plus solar module line with BIS certification, a commercial-scale compressed biogas plant commissioned in 10 months, and progress on multiple sustainability-linked initiatives tied to Reliance's net carbon zero 2035 goal. Reliance was telling the market that Anant should be read not as a mascot for sustainability, but as an apprentice to heavy industry. That distinction matters because new energy at Reliance is not a software-style adjacency. It is a capital-heavy manufacturing and infrastructure program centered on the Dhirubhai Ambani Green Energy Giga Complex at Jamnagar. Reliance's public targets here are concrete and expansive. At the 2025 annual general meeting, Mukesh invited Anant to present the exploration and production, oil to chemicals, and new energy businesses for the first time. In family capitalism, public voice at the AGM is not a decorative detail. The company laid out the next phase of the build-out. The first 200-megawatt heterojunction solar modules had already been produced. It planned to ramp solar module manufacturing to 10 gigawatt peak and then 20 gigawatt peak capacity. The battery gigafactory would begin commissioning in 2026 with 40 gigawatt hours of annual capacity, expandable to 100 gigawatt hours. The electrolyzer gigafactory would become operational by the end of 2026 with capacity of up to 3 gigawatts per year. The company reiterated an ambition to reach 3 million metric tons per annum of green hydrogen equivalent by 2032. It also described plans for compressed biogas, including 55 plants that year and more than 500 by 2030. This is also the domain with the sharpest execution risk. New energy manufacturing is won through process control, technology partnerships, procurement, cost discipline, and uncomfortable iteration. Reuters reported in January 2026 that Reliance said its battery storage manufacturing plans remained unchanged after a media report suggested a pause in lithium-ion cell plans tied to Chinese technology restrictions. Even if the reassurance proves accurate, the episode showed how exposed the program can be to external bottlenecks. Reuters also reported in 2026 that Jio was developing multi-gigawatt AI-ready data centers, with one Jamnagar facility expected to add more than 120 megawatts in the second half of 2026, and noted that renewable-powered data centers could benefit from backward integration. This is the kind of crosslink that makes Reliance alluring to investors. Green energy feeding AI infrastructure, both hosted on a site already shaped by heavy industry, but execution and monetization remain risks. If factories slip, if product competitiveness disappoints, or if the economics of hydrogen and storage remain stubborn, the market may begin to see the new energy assignment less as a hard-earned operating brief and more as a dynastic showcase. Anand therefore faces the hardest burden, persuading investors that he is not just the most symbolically visible heir of the future, but a credible custodian of complex industrial execution. So what would it actually mean for Reliance to institutionalize a dynasty? It would not mean removing the family. Reliance is not turning itself into a purely manager-run corporation in which the Ambanis retreat into passive shareholding. Nor is it behaving like a feudal estate in which each heir simply inherits a province to command. The emerging model is more hybrid, federated family capitalism with professional operating cores. The evidence lies in the governance architecture and in the public language around it. As of 2026, the board of Reliance Industries includes Mukesh Ambani as chairman and managing director, with Isha and Akash as non-executive directors and Anant as executive director. Alongside them sit independent directors and experienced executives. The company's governance reporting describes a structured leadership succession plan run through the Human Resources, Nomination, and Remuneration Committee. The children are embedded in businesses that also have serious professional management. The parent has a board and committee framework. The transition is visible, but not abrupt enough to make the enterprise feel decapitated. Capital allocation still clears through Mukesh, but the operating businesses increasingly possess their own scale, metrics, and executive depth. The post-Dhirubhai trauma taught Mukesh the danger of ambiguity when a giant empire is seen as a single indivisible throne. By dividing the future into domains, he lowers the risk of a single succession contest. But domain division is not enough by itself. Conglomerates do not endure merely because responsibilities are partitioned.
They endure if the partitions do not become fractures. Here, we arrive at the deepest uncertainty around Reliance's future. The group still depends heavily on group-level coherence. Geo, retail, media, energy, and the emerging AI and new energy stack all make more sense when seen as parts of a connected whole. Who, after Mukesh, will ensure that the pieces continue reinforcing one another rather than merely coexisting? This is where the institutionalization effort remains incomplete. Mukesh Ambani's distinctive value has never been merely that he controls Reliance. It is that he sees links others do not see, or at least acts on them with more scale and conviction. He saw telecom not as a narrow carrier business, but as a gateway into digital life. He saw retail not just as stores, but as distribution infrastructure. He sees Jamnagar not just as a refinery, but as a site from which to attack materials, energy transition, data centers, and industrial-scale manufacturing. That is founder cognition, not simply founder authority. Boards can formalize oversight. Committees can structure succession. Professional managers can run operations beautifully. But the synthesis function is harder to institutionalize because it resembles strategic imagination more than formal control. Reliance's challenge is not simply to pass down assets, it is to pass down the ability to think across them. There are mechanisms that can help. A serious board capable of forcing group-level thinking, group-level strategy and finance leadership capable of evaluating capital allocation across domains rather than allowing each vertical to harden into a silo, internal talent development, especially if future leaders rotate across businesses instead of growing up in one protected chamber. Anand's cross-domain apprenticeship suggests Reliance understands this, but whether these mechanisms will become culturally real is another question. Culture may be the decisive variable. Founder-led conglomerates benefit from a peculiar clarity. Everyone knows who can make the call, break ties, and force long-term bets through temporary pain. Once the founder becomes less central, organizations can grow more bureaucratic, more political, and more cautious. Institutionalization is supposed to solve for continuity, but it often imports the risk of mediocrity. The danger is that the company becomes more governable and less bold. Mukesh appears aware of that trap. His speeches on succession are not the speeches of a man trying to turn Reliance into a sleepy trust. They are full of the vocabulary of renewal, scale, future building, and youth. He is trying to preserve aggression while distributing authority. That is an extremely difficult trick. Many dynastic firms can preserve control by becoming conservative. Fewer can preserve entrepreneurial ferocity once the founder is no longer the sole center of gravity. The external environment makes the challenge harder. Reliance is not institutionalizing itself in a calm era. Oil to chemicals faces sanctions complications, geopolitical shocks, and freight volatility. Retail faces organized retail, e-commerce, and quick commerce competition. Geo faces the task of proving new layers of growth and AI monetization even as it prepares for a listing. New energy faces manufacturing, technology, and commercialization risk. Media integration adds another layer of complexity. Institutionalization is being stress-tested in real time. That fact may actually help. Dynastic transitions often fail because the heir generation is too protected. Reliance is not offering that luxury. Akash, Isha, and Anand are taking more visible roles in businesses that are huge but also contested. If they emerge from this period with credible operating authority and strategic confidence, the legitimacy they gain will be more robust than anything conferred by title. The most honest answer to whether a dynasty built on one man's genius can be institutionalized is partly already, but not yet fully proven. Reliance in 2026 looks like a deeply capitalized conglomerate with visible next-generation roles, meaningful professional management, formal governance mechanisms, and multiple engines of scale. None of this is fake, and yet none of it abolishes the fact that Mukesh Ambani remains the central synthesizer of the whole system. The old hydrocarbon engine still finances the future. The Rosneft contract showed that the road to green ambition still runs through crude. Across the empire, the father remains not merely the founder, but the harmonizer. The transition at Reliance is from singular centrality to plurality. The third generation has arrived, but not as three sovereigns inheriting separate kingdoms. They have arrived as strategic stewards of major domains inside a system their father is still trying to harden into an institution. If Reliance succeeds, it will have shown that a founder-built empire in an emerging market can move from charisma to system without surrendering ambition. If it fails, the failure will probably not look dramatic at first. It will look like drift. Geo will remain valuable but narrower than hoped. Retail will remain large but less strategically sharp. New energy will stay promising but perpetually about to scale. The businesses will still be powerful, but the whole will lose some of the force that once came from being orchestrated as one organism. The most revealing sentence may be the one Mukesh used in 2024 when he described the next generation as first among equals. It was not just a phrase of family diplomacy. It was a clue about the design of future Reliance. The empire he built may not be inheritable as a single crown, but it may yet be governable as a disciplined federation. The founder made the empire by concentration. The heirs will have to preserve it by coordination.